Hello everyone in here and everybody online. I'd like to start this morning by acknowledging the First Nations owners of the land where QT now stands, the Turrbal and Yagara people. I also recognise that sovereignty of this land has never been ceded, and also that this has always been a place of learning, teaching, creativity and culture. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. So, welcome. On behalf of the Creative Placemaking for Social Impact Research Group, I would like to say thank you very much for coming today. I don't know why I looked back there then, I felt as though someone was there. Both in person and online. This is our very first event and we're really thrilled to be hosting the symposium. A little bit about this group. The vision for the research group is to examine the really crucial role of arts and culture and also place-based creativity in community recovery and resilience. And this year has taught us a lot about recovery and resilience. The purpose of the group is to bring together researchers and practitioners from the creative practice school, from design, from communication and from health. And we collaborate on interdisciplinary research projects. So, 2020. It's been a year and it has changed everything, I think, about the way most people go about their lives. And it's also changed some of the things that we thought we might be doing as a research group and also some of the focus that we thought we might be looking at and certainly some of the projects that we thought we'd be doing this year that we couldn't do. But what it has shown us is that COVID-19 has exposed a range of deficits about the way we think of community, of connection and social well-being. But it's also provided some real opportunities to reimagine the ways that we share our cultural experiences between communities, between localities and between nations. And it's shown us that we really need to think about how we creatively reimagine our shared futures and has really driven home the point that our futures are shared and tied to one another. So we hope to progress that conversation that has started all over the world and progress that a little bit today and over the next 2 days here. It's a crazy end to a crazy year, so we know that there are lots of people who either aren't able to make it over the next couple of days or due to the time difference internationally can't make it, so we are recording all of the presentations and we'll be uploading those onto the website for the research group. And before I introduce our keynote speaker, I really want to thank all of our keynotes. We're just so thrilled and humbled to have such three amazing people to speak each day. And also to all of our presenters, everyone who's presenting I know has been incredibly busy and this has been something that you've squeezed in at the end of semester and we just appreciate it enormously. Thank you to the Creative Industries faculty and to the School of Creative Practice for their support. And thank you to Freya as well, who has been organiser, event planner and academic wrangler extraordinaire. This literally would not be happening without you, so thank you very much. Okay, so we are incredibly lucky to have Danya Sherman as our keynote speaker today. I have been an admirer of Danya's work for a number of years and I had the great good fortune to interview her as part of another research project along with the folks at Art Place America. And Danya, Art Place America and some of the incredible work at the University of Florida for me have been some of the most inspiring and innovative approaches to community wellbeing around the world. So, Danya is the founder and director of Boston-based consulting firm Sherman Cultural Strategies. She's currently a senior consultant on the research strategies team at Art Place America, where she teaches courses on creative community development and designs field-building activities aimed at integrating the arts into equitable community development. Sorry, I'm losing my voice a little bit after this semester. Her writing and journalism has been published in Shelter Force, Next City, Take Shape and by Rutgers University Press. She addressed audiences at Providence Athenaeum, the Boston Society of Architects, the New School, Drexel University and elsewhere on equitable urban development. Danya holds a Master's in City Planning from MIT and a Bachelor of Arts from Wesleyan University. Her talk today is on arts, culture and regenerative community development. So I'll hand over to Danya. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Donna, and thank you everyone at QUT for inviting me and for organizing this event. Thank you, Freya, Jeremy, and everyone else for making this happen. Donna, I was so pleased when you reached out and just so admire your work and have realized how similar our efforts are across many continents and nations. So just really excited to be here to continue the conversation and wish I could be there in person for the rest of the conference. I'm zooming in from Boston, or near Boston, the unceded territory of the Wampanoag and Massachusetts people. And this morning or evening, my time, I'd like to talk with you about the role that arts and culture can play in the practice and the impact of regenerative community development. Also losing my voice a little bit. Overall, what I hope to get across to you today is how I've learned that the arts are, of course, valuable in their own right, but in addition, that incorporating creativity into the way that we build our cities, develop our communities, manage our social systems, build our government, and et cetera, can help to humanize these systems that are currently quite inhumane. So this is not just about adding an arts program here or there. This is about deconstructing and reconstructing the way that we think about ourselves and our communities and the systems in place to manage them. I'm going to talk today about my professional journey in this work, but will also incorporate my own personal experience. And on that note, I'm forever inspired by the work of Emma Goldman, who was a Jewish feminist and worker rights organizer who emigrated to the United States from a town probably quite similar to the one that my ancestors were from in contemporary Lithuania, what was then the Russian Empire, in the late 19th century. In addition to being an intellectual and a revolutionary, she was also an arts and music lover. And this quote, "If I can't dance, I don't want to be part of your revolution," shows that she saw the value of making sure that organizing and community building had arts and music to animate it. The kind of culture shift that is embodied in that practice, which is what I want to talk to you about today. My own journey to realize that we not only need more arts, but an arts integrated culture shift in the way that we do community development was largely shaped by my experience working at the Highline, where I was for over 7 years and founded and directed the community engagement and public programming department. For those who are unfamiliar, the Highline is an elevated freight rail that runs along the west side of Manhattan in New York City. It was built in the 1930s as a freight rail, an industrial freight rail, and was saved from demolition by community residents, specifically a team led by these two, Robert Hammond and Joshua David. And the first portion of it opened as a public park in 2009. In the process of saving and developing the Highline, the organization did much more than the average amount of community engagement work. There were meetings, mailings, lots of surveys over a period of years to figure out what should become of this industrial relic. And I think a lot of the meetings look probably similar to engagement or community meetings, for, at least around the United States. Someone usually at the front of the room making a presentation that people in the audience are then asked to sort of respond to. But while there was a lot of community engagement and input sought, big decisions were mostly left to a team of very high-powered folks. And while the community was asked for opinions, the community that was asked for opinions was pretty racially and socioeconomically diverse. Most of the decision makers, as they often are, were white and well off, and perhaps more importantly, the culture of the organization, as most of the cultures of our organizations and government agencies are, were that of a traditional, sort of bureaucratic, hierarchical organization. This culture, this dominant culture dynamic, is something that the author Tama Okun calls white supremacy culture. These are, as she writes, norms and standards that are used without proactively being chosen by the group that is using them. And I'll leave this up for a minute to let you read some of the qualities that she talks about. This piece is available online, and I would really urge you to read it if you haven't already. Most of the ways that I was taught is reflected in a lot of these characteristics, and most of the ways that I was sort of professionalized is also reflected in these characteristics as well. Many of our organizations are paternalistic, with power concentrated at the top. Our organizations in the social sector even are often incentivized to be managed like businesses, where quantity is privileged over quality, and arbitrary deadlines often take precedence over getting things right. And this shows up especially in my experience in urban planning and community development. On the right is Sherry Arnstein's ladder of citizen participation, which was a conceptual tool that she created to note the way that community development and urban planning usually happens. So you'll see that on the bottom is things like therapy and manipulation, which she calls often governments do or nonprofits do in sort of quote unquote community engagement efforts, where at the top, what she thought was better was actual citizen control of the process. And towards the middle is sort of this idea of consultation with community, even that community that's going to be most directly impacted by the project, which was definitely the case at the Highline, and I would say is often the best case scenario of what government agencies or nonprofits do. So I think here I see kind of the connection between the way that practicing community development is steeped in white supremacy culture. So when the Highline opened, after this lengthy consultative process had occurred, which again was more community engagement than usually happens in the process of designing something like this. In 2009, we found that park visitors were not demographically representative of the city of New York or even of the neighborhood in terms of geography, race, class, age, and education levels. When we tabled at a local community center, many who lived in the social housing just a half a block away from the park had never been. It just sort of wasn't on their radar. And at the same time, the park was making news all over the world as a huge success. I think this contrast to me really indicates that when we design and develop with unquestioned white supremacy culture, we get business as usual results, meaning that the infrastructure that we develop is not for everyone, and in fact is often for mostly white and well-off people. So after finding this discrepancy in our surveying, we couldn't redesign the park, but I was in a position to redesign our public programming. So we went back to the drawing board in the programming department and to try to do a different kind of community engaged process. We built on the relationships that had been created in that first round of design engaged community, but through the help of a fabulous consultant named Lisa Yancey, we hired to help us through the process. She guided us towards new ways of working and thinking. One of the things that she led us to do was hire a group of 6 young people, all of whom lived in the social housing communities right near the park. We went through a training process together with the youth where we talked about the value of proactive interviewing, surveying, and public speaking. And then one Highline staff person and one youth member of the staff went together in pairs and knocked on every door in the social housing, which was over 5,000 residents. And instead of surveying for data, we primarily asked open-ended questions and began a lot of important conversations that were mostly geared towards relationship building. Out of this process, a lot blossomed. We learned a few trends: that people needed employment opportunities, that they wanted things for youth to do, and that they wanted to connect with nature. And these were all things that the organization that was stewarding the High Line and the park itself could work to build. And I myself, I think, went through a lot of processing and changing through this process in terms of thinking about new ways of working to combat my own and others' bias and make space for more than just what the designers had perhaps been thinking about when building the park. Through these deepened relationships, we co-designed and developed a series of over 400 programs for all ages each year on the park. They included such things like a program called Step to the High Line, where New York City's best step teams performed at the park and also taught others how to step. A live band salsa series, and several teen employment and curatorial programs. And many of these programs came not only from neighbor suggestions, but were co-designed, co-produced, and co-hosted by community member organizations. Several of the then youth who worked with us during that time have come back to work with the High Line in increasing capacity. One went on to work with the city council, and in other ways have become, part of the community in more intense regard. So while these programs did a lot to expand who the High Line was for, the realization that more might have been done during the design and development phase began to permeate the organization. Here is a quote from Robert Hammond, the co-founder, saying, "Instead of what the design should look like, I wish we'd asked more openly, what can we do?" And again, the point here is less about the High Line and more about the dominant culture that it's steeped in. Like I said, the organization did a lot more than your average group does when they're designing a park. It's, to me, simply one example of an organization responding to the way that its leaders were taught and who the system is set up to benefit. And given the history of urban planning and community development, we couldn't be surprised by this. This mapping just shows one countless examples of how racism is steeped in the practice of urban planning and community development in the United States. On the left, this is Austin, Texas, where I recently completed a project. On the left was a map of 1928 showing how the city had created an urban plan where they forced African American and Mexican American families to move to areas that were more polluted and less developable, and then proceeded to develop highways and other industrial uses in those neighborhoods. And then on the right, a map showing the practice of redlining, which was a process where the federal government backed mortgages for purchasing homes in specific areas around cities all across the United States. And they would determine the level of risk in each part of the cities, and more often than not, it had to do with race. So they would insure home mortgages in areas that were white, not as much in areas that were Black and Mexican American, in this case in Austin. So this obviously further decreased property values and the wealth building capacity for people of color, and negatively impacted their health. And over again, I think we kind of see the paternalistic power of the state causing positive outcomes for white folks and negative outcomes for people of color. I began learning this history after I left the High Line, and after nearly a decade of work there, went back to school to do a degree in urban planning, and really began learning this history for the first time, and reflecting for the first time, given my own privileged experience growing up in a white neighborhood in Chicago, started to put the puzzle pieces together between this history and the experience that I had had in my own education. Around that same time, I began consulting with Art Place America, and as Donna mentioned, Art Place is a 10-year collaboration between several foundations in the US, federal agencies, and financial institutions. It was set up as a 10-year collaboration and sadly is coming to a close at the end of this year, in about a month. And its mission has been to position artists as allies in equitable community development, which it did through grant making, field building, and research. 5 years ago, when I started working with ArtPlace, we had just begun conducting practice-based research to understand how the arts were impacting communities in various arenas of community development, such as transportation, housing, public health, etc. And on the ArtPlace website, you can find papers demonstrating the results of these research in all these different sectors. And the culmination of this research will be a comprehensive look at the impacts of the arts in community development, as evidenced by hundreds of groups working across the US. We'll be publishing this, on our website and social media where you can find us. And the website will remain live after we come to a close. So when we began this research, our research director, Jamie Hand, thought that it might be simply a matter of figuring out what the community development folks considered success, and then articulating what the arts do in their language so that those working in community development could understand it. But what I think we realized after having the good fortune of really digging more deeply into the work that these groups around the country are doing is that it was less a question of translation and more a question of how these systems of community development need to be transformed. For example, in the course of researching the first paper that we wrote on arts and affordable housing and developing a course around this paper, we had the chance to organize a learning workshop at Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation. This is a grassroots community development organization run by and for the Lakota people on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. It was began out of spiritual practice many years ago, and arts and culture is deeply rooted throughout the way that it operates. In fact, at our recent summit, the ED Tatewi actually pushed back on the idea of even calling arts and culture something separate, because in her own practice, it's just life ways, right? This is one part of the same way of practicing. Thunder Valley is building an entire new community as an example of what Native-led development can look like, that they hope can be replicated across the country. It is regenerative, not just sustainable, because it is bringing back Native traditions that are enriching the community and regrowing the resources and cultures that have been exploited and taken from these communities, both in terms of natural resources and in terms of animal stewardship and cultural practice as well. Just one example of this is in the process of developing the community plan, the architects first came up with a version that was rectilinear with streets at right angles and that sort of thing. The Elder Artist Committee, which was not just advisory, as they often are, actually had decision-making power in this case and brought it back to the community, and they just rejected it wholesale. They said this was never a way that they would design our community. The planners then went back to the drawing board, which almost never happens, and came back after more closely collaborating with community members to something that looked like this, and is now being developed. It's curvilinear with homes in circles, as has been the tradition, and the entire community is centered on a powwow grounds, which a ritualistic design. Another example of the way integrating arts and culture is more than additive, it is transformative, is a group called Push Buffalo, which is in New York State, a post-industrial city called Buffalo. And Push, a community-based organization, works on the west side of the city, a neighborhood that the city had long neglected but is very culturally rich and diverse. Push began as a community-based organization, door knocking to develop its priorities based on what residents need. And it now owns over 120 properties in the neighborhood and works holistically on weatherization, green infrastructure, affordable housing, workforce development, and a lot more. Push partially credits the staying power of its organization because of the way that arts and culture have been naturally woven throughout its work. One example of this is Push has a drumming group that shows up at protests and community events. And instead of just organizing health or energy fairs, they organize concerts where neighbors can also find information about health and energy efficiency. Their public artwork on the left is both beautiful but also meaningful. These are neighborhood leaders that were chosen by other residents to be honored on the fence of community organization's parking lot. And their organizing is still very much the guiding force of how they prioritize their work. They hold regular member meetings which dictate the priorities for the organization. And these often incorporate artistic ways of engagement as well, as you can see on the right. These past 3 years, they've been developing an old school building into a complex that combines a home for a community-based theater alongside nonprofit office space and affordable housing for seniors. And these were all priorities that the community determined in their several meetings and gatherings. Just a couple of other examples of projects that we've been lucky enough to get to elevate through our work at Art Place. This is the People's Paper Co-op in Philadelphia. This is a project to help people returning from prison process the trauma of returning while also expunging their criminal records, which are things that people often don't realize are still present in their records, but are maybe preventing them from getting jobs. So this is an arts integrated project where people actually print out, with the help of lawyers, their records, tear them up, and go through a process of remaking a new piece of paper that they then print on. So literally recreating something that they are owning out of something that they had created, or that the system had created for them, excuse me. And a program near me in Somerville called the Nibble program, which brings together entrepreneurs that are all immigrant women to cook and create their own food businesses and then sells them collectively to create more viable business options. A project in rural West Virginia, coal country, to create cooperatively run businesses in design, arts, and construction for former coal miners. And a market in Los Angeles called Mercado La Paloma, which is kind of an elevated version of Nibble, all immigrant-owned businesses in an affordable housing development that brings together different kinds of cultures and foods all together in one space. So as I began to try to understand and was learning about these amazing groups and articulate what was so powerful about them, I realized that, obviously this also has to do with racism and white supremacy, because it's exactly the dynamics that Tema Okun pointed out that these groups are building alternatives to. I began to really think about the fact that regenerative community development is fundamentally pushing back against the racist and colonial history that urban planning and dominant community development grew out of. I also started to recognize on a personal level these characteristics in how I was behaving and how I was taught. I began to feel sadness that as an assimilated white Jewish person, I couldn't as easily identify the regenerative characteristics of my own culture that I found myself wanting more and more to practice. I began reckoning with my own whiteness and why it had taken me such a long time to even become aware of the racism that was all around and within me. And at this point, I also want to say that by whiteness, I do not mean white people. All of us are impacted by white supremacy culture, and the concept of whiteness is something other than people who are known as white. It's a cultural dynamic that shifts. So I like these definitions, and I'll give you the chance to read them. Without realizing it then, in Chicago growing up, my whiteness impacted me a lot, of course. I was raised on the north side of the city in a nice neighborhood with well-maintained parks, grocery stores, bus and train service, movie theaters. I grew up hearing things such as don't go to the south or west sides, entire areas of the city that also happen to be majority Black or Latinx, because they were too dangerous. Or don't go to Cabrini Green, which is an infamous social housing community that I photographed in this picture, which the implication was kind of public housing or social housing breeds degeneracy. I think I assumed that because we had what we needed, everybody else did too. These revelations led me to want to rebuild an identity and community beyond the concept of whiteness, one that acknowledges the full humanity in all of us beyond and outside our racialized selves. While I recognize, of course, that I can never be not white and will always benefit from the privileges that oppress others, I wanted to understand how we became to be white and learned our whiteness. These are some of my ancestors, my dad's great-grandparents, and several generations on the right, several generations before. So of course, before my family was racialized as white, we were Eastern European. My family left what is now Lithuania, what was then a part of the Russian Empire called the Pale of Settlement. And they left because they were oppressed, impoverished, they feared for their safety of their families. This was an area of the Russian Empire that experienced its own version of the redlining that I talked about before, where Jews in the 18th century were relocated and controlled differentially throughout the centuries. They, like so many others, left everything behind and took nearly year-long ship voyages to places, in my family's case, South Africa and the US, that they knew nothing about. And over time, both countries began to accept them as white, though of course they were still Jewish and did experience anti-Semitism. So this is our generation, the generations in South Africa, which meant that from my understanding of it, they could be free in ways that our ancestors in Lithuania could not been, or had not been, to get jobs, buy houses in good school districts, and came sort of, with the trade-off of assimilation and accepting the racial hierarchy in which many others were not free and were oppressed in very brutal ways. In the process of that, we lost many of our cultural traditions, our language, our dress, our customs, and of course, the Holocaust magnified these losses to untold levels. And while I so do appreciate the efforts my family and community have made to teach me some of our cultural traditions, I'm especially grateful for knowing how to discern a great bagel from a mediocre one, how to dance the hora, etc. But as a beneficiary of this racialization process, instead of more of those cultural traditions, I learned, without even being told that I was learning them, the cultural ideas and worldviews of whiteness. For example, the myth of meritocracy, that everyone who was doing well was doing well because they had worked hard and earned it, and that those people who weren't were perhaps lazy and less intelligent. I learned how to act professional, how to speak in boardrooms, how to carry myself in spaces of privilege, how to manage up and down the hierarchies in schools and organizations. I learned that there's supposed to be a divide between our personal and professional lives, and how to manage my emotions in professional spaces. So recently I've begun exploring how to reclaim some of the arts and cultural practices of my own ancestors, both in a way that I find very spiritually nourishing, but also a way that we can begin to dismantle white supremacist ways of working in ourselves, in my consulting practice, and in the organizations that I'm a part of. My family and I had the chance to visit Lithuania several years ago and found on the left one of the only remaining wooden synagogues that was not destroyed by the Nazis. And when I was married recently, my partner, who's a printmaker, was inspired by the folk art that had been restored in the synagogue, as you can see on the ceiling there, and used it with another printmaker to create our ketubah, or marriage contract, with artwork based on the synagogue's artwork. I've also been a member of the Worker Circle for the last few years, which is a national organization that has a chapter in Boston. This is an organization that began as an economic mutual aid society. They created shared loans and other forms of economic solidarity at a time when it was harder for Jews to get good, well-paying jobs and accessing banking services. Over time, as we've assimilated and no longer have to deal with that form of institutionalized racism, the Worker Circle has mostly become a cultural center, and I recently took a Yiddish course there. So while in the US and in Australia, Jews can mostly benefit from the privileges of whiteness, of course, many communities are actively resisting and building alternatives to that same system of oppression that provides us those privileges and provides oppression for so many others. My most recent research with ArtPlace is about this connection between arts and culture and community wealth building, which has led me to another local organization here in Boston called the Boston Ujima Project. This is an organization dedicated to the holistic liberation of Black and people of color communities. It's a democratic member-run organization that's building a cooperative economic infrastructure with a mission to return wealth to communities of color. Ujima believes that to face the systemic challenges of inequality and poverty, we need to build creative interlocking systems of tools and strategies. We need to transform the way we live, work, shop, invest, and come together as communities. And Ujima has had an arts and culture organizing aspect to their work since they began. They see it as a really important part of how they're going to rebuild an economic system that will empower working class communities and lead to a more holistically just and sustainable economy. Ujima is one of the groups that we're going to be featuring in a paper that's going to come out in the next couple of weeks on arts, culture, and community wealth building through ArtPlace. And we chose the term community wealth building instead of economic development because we wanted it to be a more values-oriented term. This paper looked across the country, again, at organizations that are working holistically, and found that many of them are working collaboratively with artists because they realize that the work will be stronger for it. As Nia Evans, the head of Boston Ujima, says, economics surround us, how we move, live, eat. If we're asking people to re-examine such central aspects of life, this is cultural work. We need new cultural affirmations for our work to follow. And with that, I will say thank you and open it up for questions. Excited to have your conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Danya. That was really incredibly thoughtful and rich. And just thinking about, I tried to think about how we're going to manage the questions. But first of all, are there any questions in the room? Because we can move the microphone around. And Dan, or if you're able to just check on the chat. So if people on Zoom want to just put a question in the chat or raise their hand, we can also do that. So while we're getting organised and you're thinking questions, I do have a question. Just thinking about the winding up of ArtPlace America at the end of this year and the incredible influence that it's had and its projects have had, is there a strategy for the kind of ongoing nature of those projects? Because it's something that we find, or I've found a lot in projects, is that once a funding body's kind of finished that cycle of it, or the grant's finished, then there's a real challenge for it to remain sustainable in communities without a lot of support. So how is ArtPlace thinking of managing those projects going forwards?
Yeah, it's a really good question. We've been thinking a lot about that, of course, and for the last few years, we've been trying to transition to a more ecosystem level funding structure. So in 2018, we ended our individual grants to organizations and instead started granting to regions around the country, and actually started a project that my colleague Mara is leading called Local Control, Local Fields, which also overlaps a lot with this idea of community wealth building. It's a community governed funding process to try to strengthen the creative placemaking ecosystem in a whole region, depending on how that funder defines its region. So in some places that's 3 states and the 23 native nations within them. In some places that's Massachusetts. That was one effort to try to like look at how we could create regional infrastructure for creative placemaking. And another aspect of the intention behind going away was to try to embed arts and culture in a lot of different other national institutions. So for example, we've been partnering in those papers that I mentioned in each of the 10 sectors of community development. They each end with a partnership with an organization in that sector. So in housing, for example, we've partnered with NeighborWorks America, which is one of the largest national community development intermediaries, and have been working with them to develop professional development training, and hopefully there'll be more grant making and other things to support arts and culture in their work. So that embedding and that regional approach are definitely two things, but of course we hope that the funders that have made ArtPlace possible will continue supporting this work, and that others will take up the mantle as well.
Thank you. Anyone in the room with questions at all? Anyone on chat? Oh, I'm going to keep asking you questions, which I'm happy to do. With the what kind of appetite is there amongst both government and non-government organisations in relation to embedding arts and culture in what they would normally think of as economic development or infrastructure projects? Has that been a kind of a difficult journey, or have you found that they generally, I know it's hard to generalise, but generally kind of come on board really quickly, understand? So I've found that communities get it really quickly, but it's often other organisations that either do or don't get it quickly, that arts and culture, that what you talk about, that's not economic development, it's kind of community wealth building and all of that. Thinking about what a community needs is really cultural work. How have you found that kind of journey for your projects with getting those kinds of organisations on board?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I'm also curious to hear about your experience with that in Australia. I think for us, my colleague Jamie has taken the very smart approach of finding individuals within those agencies and institutions who get it, as you say, because they might be artists on their own, or might be more connected to their own cultural communities, and within those practices, sometimes are a little bit more willing to kind of take on something that maybe their colleagues might think is a little bit non-traditional. So I think that's definitely something that we found to be a successful strategy. But yeah, I think it is really challenging. I think there's a lot of inertia and momentum in these huge agencies and institutions, and talking about culture shift in terms of the way decisions are made, or how long timelines are, those have big implications for the way the organization runs. So I think that that is a longer term effort and needs to be thought of as a longer term effort. But finding those allies, within the systems, I think can really help.
That's similar experience here. I can see there's a question in the chat. Danielle, to get that up. The question of the moment is, how has COVID affected or not affected conclusions that you drew from your own years of research? Are there changes that you see as necessary now?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as you said, Donna, at the beginning, that COVID has rolled pulled back the curtain on a lot of dynamics that I think a lot of the communities that we've been working with for a long time were already pointing to and working towards, and unfortunately, have hit them the hardest. And so, I think one of the things that I've noticed, which I know is a little bit different in Australia, but in the US over the last few decades, there's been a huge rollback of public funding in basic social infrastructure. And a lot of the groups that we, have supported or worked with are forced to kind of take on the basic, support of distributing food or health messaging that in other countries the government might do, and in the past the American government used to do. So one thing that we've definitely noticed is that community-based organizations have pivoted from, events, to food distribution and just really basic, social services that their communities are needing. So I think to me that shows us how, weak our infrastructure is in the US and how much we really need to rebuild that social infrastructure so that when the next crisis comes, we don't have to rely on these kind of patchwork systems or people to do that. So that's definitely one thing. Another thing that I think we've noticed is, and I know the University of Florida work talks about this a lot, but the value of the arts in getting information out to people in ways that is not dry and more understandable. So a lot of artists have been, kind of involved in simplifying or creating more dynamic health messaging through posters or commercials or other things like that. So that's definitely another thing that I think perhaps we can take and grow in the future.
Yeah, I was actually thinking of that particular example, and from University of Florida about the role of arts in health communication during crises, and we've had that example in Australia where there's been a missed opportunity in cities with culturally and linguistically diverse communities just not getting information, and if a more kind of culturally appropriate or dynamic way of communicating may have done, really made some impacts. And then on the other side, really some best practice by First Nations communities who took control over the messaging in their communities, which meant that that First Nations people led the world in how to protect really vulnerable communities using arts and culture and culturally appropriate ways of communicating within communities. So yeah, that and the work that University of Florida has done in that health communication, the arts, has been really fascinating. So, at the risk of me just ending up having a conversation with Danya, are there any questions here, or we will then wrap?
A couple more questions on chat.
Are there?
Yeah, there's one from Abby. Abby Dennis.
Oh, sorry. Okay. You could probably see this, Donna, could you talk a little more about the difference between the language of economic development and that of community wealth building? Does the latter imply wealth as more than economic benefit?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Yeah, I think, yes, definitely. So there are a couple of different concepts that kind of rolled up to our decision of not using the term economic development. I think, firstly, there's a long history of the arts, and this was another question that Gladys put in the chat of the tyranny of commercial utility, I think is what you mean, of arts being used for economic development and not necessarily for the benefit of communities of color, or in fact sometimes harming communities of color if that work does not also incorporate the necessary social infrastructure like affordable housing, or perhaps is not led by those communities itself. So I think it's one of the things was that we wanted to say, economic development, but for whom? And the concept of community wealth building starts to get us towards that a little bit more, but incorporating a specific racial justice and economic justice angle on it. And then, I think the other main thing is that thinking about wealth broadly, not just in terms of financial outcomes, but in terms of cultural wealth, in terms of the wealth of relationships that we have, and spiritual wealth, natural resource wealth, that these are all forms of resources that of course we use and benefit from, but don't, are totally ignored by our economic development systems. And when you start looking at wealth in that broader way, it becomes a lot more clear why arts and culture would be important in developing new economic systems.
And have I missed any other questions in the chat there, since I work on those?
No,
Alright, so if there's no other questions online or in the room, I'd just like everyone to join in thanking you so much, Donna. That was fantastic.
This is great. Here we are again in this hybrid world where I have a lot of beautiful faces here and people online as well. So greetings to both of those groups of people. There'll be probably a few more times I have to do this before Christmas, and we're all well practiced at it by now. So hopefully that we'll be able to run this process quite smoothly. The idea at this stage, I think, is to have our presenters first, who I'm about to introduce. We'll go from one presenter to the next and have a general Q&A at the end of that time. So if we can hold our questions, or if you've got questions probably online as we go along, you can put them in the chat and we'll come back and review them in an overall way. That might give us a chance as well to start connecting some of the great concepts that Danya was presenting with what our presenters talk about now in a general way that addresses the issues in the field and this theme today of community, which our three talkers are going to be talking about. First of all, we have Professor Robert Schweitzer, who's talking on community well-being, bringing therapeutic interventions, having a new vision for therapeutic interventions. And so we're really lucky to have Robert here in our group working across the health and creative practice space. Then we're going to move on from there to work presented by Jeremy Neideck, Younghee Park and Nathan, who are here. Their theatre work on the Hello Project, encouraging community artist identities in a digital environment. And I've just been talking about them. I know of their work a little bit through Jeremy's great PhD work and other publications, so it'll be really, really fantastic to see that work, and we can see some of the previews in the program, those great powerful images that really speak so strongly. Then we'll move from there to a presentation from Kathryn Kelly and her work with Emily Coleman, one of our great Indigenous creative arts students who's done a lot of work in arts organisations, and they're talking about their case studies in community engagement, which will just be fascinating. I'm really looking forward to hearing about what Kath's been doing with Emily, having known Emily as one of these great undergrad students who has continued on as a fantastic professional in her own right. And then we have somebody called Associate Professor Donna Hancox, who I'm always really happy to hear Donna's perspective there, and I love her title, All the Feels. And in a way that probably summarises, I think, one of the things that brings us all together here, that it's really nice to acknowledge the emotive and affective nature of what we do is really important to why we do it. And so Donna's going to be talking about creative community engagement as a way of understanding culture, place and identity. So they're the speakers we have today. We'll kind of flow on from one to the other and then come back together at the end. But I'll start now by introducing Professor Robert Schweitzer, who I'm really looking forward to hearing about his work. So let's welcome Robert now.
I'm not sure how one follows on from the talk by Danya, which really was quite profound. Do I get to control? Okay, so this is around community well-being and a vision for, well, psychotherapeutic practice. To provide some background, I'll just tell you I'm going to talk about a lot of my research which I conducted some years ago, as well as some recent research. And the opportunity of putting this presentation together has really been an incentive for me to reflect on the various paradigms which have guided the work. And so when I thought about this, I thought about my work in Africa. And I worked in Southern Africa among the Xhosa-speaking people. And if I were talking there, the first thing I would say to everyone, I would greet everyone, and the word they use is molo. So when you say molo, everyone then responds molo wetu, and it's used all the time. What's the literal translation of the word molo? The literal translation is I see you. And the response molo wetu is I see you too. So with this kind of background, I want to talk about the cultural prototypes of healing, the idea of well-being, and how we think about healing in, again, this is a different community, a different society, and how we think about healing within our own society. This is a painting by Remedios Varo, which I thought depicts the idea of the isolated individual leaving the office where it is just herself and the therapist. I think it is called leaving the psychiatrist's office. And in this we have her holding her head, about to dump some issues around her father in the well, but it really encapsulates the idea of the individual and the idea that somehow we need to understand what is going on in the mind of the individual. And if we read modern psychology, books on healing or psychotherapy, we come towards a world where we try to think about the standardization of therapy, where therapies are now being manualized and the profession is regulated. This then carries a whole lot of assumptions in terms of the paradigm of what it means to be an individual and what healing means. And if I can quote an anecdote by a colleague of mine, she went to see a therapist. She said, Robert, I went to see this CBT therapist. And you know what he told me? He told me that my thoughts were irrational. We need to challenge them. And then she said, how cheeky is that? Whereas if we think about healing in other cultures, and I'm going to talk about my work working among the Xhosa-speaking people, and I'll see if this works. Okay, so this refers to an area where I did spend many years looking at healing among a group of people, and it's undertaken by a healer. Some people would refer to, in this case it was a witch doctor, which of course is a nonsense. He is a healer within the community. But what is striking about healing and the community generally is the relationship to land and to the river, because everyone, and they would say, including myself and others, we all have ancestors by definition. The ancestors do not disappear, but they actually exist. They would believe in the forest if your ancestors are of the forest, or in the river if your ancestors are of the river, and they have their own lives, they have their own cattle. And the healing is the healer, and this is the man I worked with, his name was Mongezi Tiso. He is someone who's able to tell people what brings them to see him, what is wrong with them, what is the cause of what is going on, and he then is, in a sense, communicates between the ancestors and the living. Now, one of the interesting parts of the healing is that it always involves ritual. This is him with his partner, who's also a healer. Her name was Mamdracha. I could talk about the symbolism of the beads and so on, but other than to say everything has meaning and they will communicate with the community, which is part of a basic human activity. So anyone who goes for healing, there really isn't this whole idea of privacy and secrecy about any of it. It occurs in the community. people will walk past, listen for a few moments, and then carry on with their daily business. And so I'm going to share with you a very quick video of a healing process which I happen to have witnessed for many hours on many days. And this is a healer. Actually, did I touch something? I shouldn't have. Do anyone help me go back to the previous slide? Okay, so I think I touched on the reference. I meant to just play the ceremony, but before I do, I'll just tell you what you're going to see. You're going to see healers dressed in the regalia. If you look carefully, you'll see there are two patients. They're painted in white. They both suffer from a condition known as ukutwaza, which means they've been called to be healers themselves. The word ukutwaza is interesting in of itself because it means to be reborn or to reappear as of the new moon. I wonder if anyone's able to make that work. I'm just not trusting myself. Yes, it is. If you press at the bottom, as I recall. Or you can just play one of those videos there. It'll work. It's not the right one, but they're all much the same. Be able to get sound. Sunset, and every morning before the sun rises they'll engage in the same process where you'll talk about your dreams of that night, and the healer will tell you what these dreams or where they come from, what they mean, and what their ancestors are wishing to communicate to you. So this is a system of healing where healing by its very nature in terms of the paradigm is communal, where ritual, some degree of altered states of consciousness, which is through the music. The ancestors are always involved in healing, and it occurs very much within the context of the community. So that's the first part of the research I wanted to share with you. The second part of the research I want to share with you has to do with the idea of working with people from refugee backgrounds. And most recently, we worked with a group of refugees in Australia, and they are all regarded as women at risk, or they're a particular group where they have had the most awful experiences. Now, let me go right to tell you what the kind of things we found, and I'll go backwards. So we reported on the level of trauma, which is high, over 26%, anxiety over 50%, depression and somatization. Now, I think what we've done is to make the classic error, in a sense, of always thinking about somehow the psychopathology existing within the individual. And this is what I'm going to talk about in terms of what I'm talking about in terms of paradigms, that really what has occurred to people and how we approach these issues needs to actually think much more about community, about trauma always being interpersonal, about the sexual violence. And when we ask people what actually happened to you, we can see over 70% of people experience the lack of food or water, ill health, watching or seeing people being murdered, being isolated from others, and forced separation from others. And the point I'm wishing to make is that we need to think about both trauma and about the way in which we respond to trauma. Is it really something that exists within the individual in terms of the isolated mind, or do we really need to reconceptualize trauma in terms of a relational paradigm which exists within community? And by the same token, maybe we need to rethink the paradigms which in fact inform our work. So I want to talk about this idea of paradigms, about the limitations of our own paradigms in terms of healing, and the ones which characterize modern psychology, which are very individualistic, which are reductionistic, and they are highly rational towards a different kind of a paradigm. And the paradigm I'm trying to envision, and at this point it is really thinking about how do we have a different kind of paradigm to think about psychology, and it is one that moves away from a restricted relationship between a therapist and patient to a paradigm which includes a much more I would use the phenomenological concept of co-constitutionality. That is an appreciation of what constitutes the sense of self, what constitutes person, is also co-constituted by other people and by place, as we saw in the very first slide in terms of the early work I did with healers. And the sense of place is exemplified by the very idea that no one ever walks across a bridge, across a river. You would always pick up a stone and what they call shlonipo, or honor the ancestors, throwing it into the river. So there's a very different relationship. The second kind of characteristic of a different kind of paradigm is one which privileges the narratives of people who seek healing over reductionistic principles of biological or encapsulated senses of self and determinism, which characterizes so much of modern psychotherapy. And then the third characteristic of this paradigm is one that reconceptualizes the notion of therapist towards the idea of a healer, and that is a move from a more restricted one-to-one relationship to one which includes metaphor, symbolisms, and ritual. And I'd like to exemplify some of these notions, not by saying exactly what healing would look like, but simply sharing a digital story which we did as part of our research. And this was a woman who arrived in Brisbane from Africa. They came, I think, from memory from the DRC via South Africa to Australia, where she shares her experience. And I'll now get it. Shall I try and make it play? I'll just press. That's an embedded video again. I think you click on there, yes.
Togetherness. Xenophobia engulfed Ubuntu. We no longer knew who we were. We had to flee again. We found a temporary refuge in the public park in the middle of the city of Durban. It was an open cage, a prison with no roof or walls to shield us. People who were sleeping alongside my family in the park were not bound by Ubuntu. They were terrorized, lost, blindfolded, and helpless. I remember the night when I got separated from my mentor and my friend, my father. The night was silent until the enemy came knocking. The noise of the vans could be heard. The chaos left separation and distortion. Women and children running and hiding, but no man could be spared. Till the good Samaritan rushed in and gave a helping hand. My mind was too despaired to comprehend. The morning came and a foreign language said good morning. It felt safe, a place I could not mourn nor worry in the storm, but I never saw that again. The day came when I smiled. Many could call it a camp, but I called it a home, 'cause that was where my pile dreams were discovered. I joined LEAP, an organization that bared fruits of knowledge, leadership, and education. I think a lot about the meaning of leadership. Leadership is not about pride or selfishness. It should be about people. Most presidents in Africa inherit their power through family lines, and they abuse it. In their ignorance, they destroy togetherness. For them, it's about autocracy, not democracy. It leads to suffering, killings, and displacement. Leading people through example, that's what I think true leadership is. Being a role model, even to your brothers and sisters, even to your mom. That's what my dad taught me. He was the best dad in the world. Happiness and laughter followed him around. He truly cared about people. He often said, don't look down to anybody and don't give with intention to receive back. Do it because you love it and because it comes from inside, from the heart. People you relate to, people you meet and work with, they are your family. Family is not blood, but the bond you've created. Now I know that this is the real Ubuntu.
Okay, so I want to just conclude with the quote in terms of the meaning of Ubuntu, and there's another expression, Umuntu nga muntu nga bantu, and that is a person is a person through other people. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Did we want to pass the mic or just speak?
Yeah.
We had a bit of a debate about how to.
Maybe we'll just shuffle. See how that goes.
We'll shuffle. Hi. Now, do I need to do anything special to get my PowerPoint slide up? There we go. Hi. So I just want to start off by joining Donna in acknowledging that we're on the unceded land of the Yagara and the Turrbal people, and want to acknowledge that this has been a place of storytelling and research and continuous culture for a long time, and we're a very tiny speck kind of in the current moment. And also just kind of acknowledge if there's any First Nations people joining us here or online in the ether, as we all seem to be in the ether these days. My name's Jeremy Neideck, and I'm joined here by Younghee Park and Nathan Stoneham. And also in solidarity, somewhere in that ether is our fourth collaborator, Mick McKeague, who's currently in Melbourne. And we're looking forward to Mick joining us in a couple of weeks. So we're here to have a chat about the Hello Project. But first we're going to start off in a way that we always do as a company, and that's with what we call a ding-dong. So the name of this comes from this particular piece of sheet music, which holds a bit of kind of mythology in the culture of our company. We won't get into that here. But what we mean by ding-dong is a moment to check in together. And we check in as a part of our creative process. And usually this, in our current creative process, it takes hours and hours actually for us to check in. But we'll just do a little bit of a version here. So I'll go first, and then we'll have my friends join us. So my name's Jeremy Neideck. You can call me Jeremy, or Jez, or Jezza, as some people call me. My pronouns here and now are he, him, and his. And today I'm just going to check in as a number. I'm an 8 out of 10, and I'm looking forward to going a little bit further up.
Hello. My name is Younghee. You can call me Younghee or PYH. Everybody call me PYH with my initial. And female pronouns, she, her, hers. And today I feel like a sunny summer day because I'm going to have a holiday next few days. Yes.
Hey everyone, I'm Nathan. You can call me Nathan, and I use he, him, his. And I'll check in as Babe Pig in the City today. I've come down from Ginnaburra country in the Sunshine Coast hinterland, and yeah, it's lovely to be here. This is the first time talking about this work outside of the process, so I feel like after that keynote, this is the right place and the right space to have this chat. Thanks.
So with checking in for us, and we submitted these slides on Friday before we finished the presentation, so everything's in a little bit of a state, but it helps us to build an opportunity for shared understanding in the space together. And as we'll see in a moment, this is a big part of the Hello project, and we check in lots of different ways, including in ways that help us get towards creative content for the project. Content's a bit of a gross word. Actually, creative material that we're co-building together. Okay, so now, who are we? So for over 2 decades, a creative community has flourished between Australia and South Korea, initiated by the work of the late theatre maker Roger Rind. And the work of the artist maintaining Roger's legacy has always been really difficult to define, partially because of its really wide-ranging form. From play-based work for children and families, bilingual music theatre that's focused on building healthy queer communities, to dance theatre that combines traditional Korean dance, traditional Korean opera and expressionistic contemporary dance. But what does bind all of these disparate practices together is a focus on friendship as a methodology. So Company Bad is a family of artists who were mentored by Roger, and who until his sudden passing in 2010, he had worked in Korea alongside his wife Kathryn Pease for almost 2 decades. Our collective is built on a foundation provided by the lives that we share together. And the responsibility of carrying this creative DNA, it falls to whoever happens to be in the room together at that time. So our early work, for example, was a case study for how a team of artists came together. Team of artists generates its own playbook, when their coach is suddenly gone missing. And lessons that we've learnt for how to work together across language, across culture, has had to be constantly remembered and relearned, and with kind of the tacit knowledge that's shared amongst our family of collaborators has been slightly codified in some ways. You can see that ding-dong process has grown out of long, hard soul-searching for why things really weren't working. And it'd be a nice fiction for us to say that the way that we work together is just built on some kind of loose power of friendship. But in fact, friendship, as you can probably understand, is a lot of hard work. Tillman Healy writes that research undertaken with friendship as its methodology needs to be undertaken over many years at the natural pace of friendship. And that as a project's issues emerge organically, the unfolding path of the relationships becomes the path of the project. So let's hear a little bit about the project.
The Hello project is an inclusive community arts workshop and performance making project being undertaken over 2 years in Chuncheon, South Korea. In early 2017, our long-term Korean partner and good old friend Stepsol Company and Company Bad started conversation about the idea of Hello Project. In 2018, we kicked off the project with Australia-Korea Foundation funding, and over time, support for the project grew, attracting support from Ministry of Culture, Sports and Tourism, Chuncheon City Government, Chuncheon Cultural Foundation, and Korea Disability Arts and Culture Center, who've joined as co-funding bodies of the project. So who the partners are? Hello Project is a collaboration between Company Bed, us, Chuncheon Arts Festival, Corporation Tanspoon, which is Stepsol, and Women Striving for a Better Tomorrow, a social rights and cultural advocacy organization run by and for people living with disability. Since last winter, Chuncheon City Government became a main funder of the project, and recently, Chuncheon City Government announced full funding for the next year's round. Therefore, Hello Project can carry on with its third year of life. Yes. Whew. Hello Project participants are mostly based in Chuncheon. When we started the project, most of the participants already knew each other quite well through various Chuncheon disability communities and disability human rights activism movement. In the beginning, there was an invisible hierarchical relationships by age, social role, gender, and even according to the degree of disability. However, this group has shifted to a move horizontal and collaborative relationship within the project, which became one of the factors that will assist in Hello Project continuing as a long-term project.
All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our ways of working. It's kind of based on a collaborative model of devising performance and also drawing on a lot of community development principles. One of the important parts of our project is not to predetermine much at all, which is quite tricky when you have to convince everyone that you know what you're doing before you start. But not having a strict plan about what we're going to make or even what we're going to do together allows us to be a lot more responsive in the room. So our planning then is less about what are we going to do and more about how are we going to be together. And we try and practice how we are going to be together through our workshop process. We've developed a bit of a culture in this way of working, and some things have become quite ingrained. Even though they're ingrained, they're still reflected on. We'll hold on to them as long as we need them. One of them is that no one needs to leave their shit at the door. So we invite you to arrive as your whole self in the state that you are today. And we have some trust that as a group, that will be okay. It might be hard. We hope that, as a group, we'll get better and better at welcoming people for who they are into each room. It also gives us a chance to evaluate what we should stick to the plan and what we should let go of in the plan. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that someone has come to a workshop the day after their house burnt down. And, you could launch into your workshop plan and that person may never get a chance to explain what's happened. So it's just a kind of example, one drastic example that first we negotiate what's an appropriate thing to do today, and then we'll start doing that. Another kind of culture of this work is that everyone is a part of the ensemble. Now, some people try and sneak into the room and not be a part of the ensemble. They're usually counsellors or funders or local media photographers or venue staff. And they want to be invisible and they want to watch and they want to be ignored. And it's coming from a place of being polite, but it doesn't make sense to us. Who are they and why are they here and why are they watching? So we must meet them. And that's a part of the process. It might interrupt what we're doing, but whoever comes in becomes a part of the ensemble while they're in the space, which means they have to do a ding-dong. We have to understand why they're here, what they're doing, and we have to get to know each other. This is connected to one of our social outcomes, which is bridging social differences. So we are constantly questioning the barrier between, or the border between, who's a participant and who's not. We're all participants in this project, and if you're in the room, you're a participant too. So it's not about people with disability being the participants. It's not about English or Korean speakers being the participants. those lines are constantly blurred and negotiated as we go. I'll briefly talk about those social outcomes because occasionally it's useful for us to know what they are and to measure them. It's not our deep passion to identify and measure social outcomes, but we can do it and we can communicate it to support the work we do. So that bridging social differences is one, and we use the Cultural Development Network's kind of schema for this, and we acknowledge that separating social and cultural outcomes might be a bit of a myth sometimes, and we know that a lot more social impact happens than the one that we're measuring, but the ones that we measure, bridging social differences and also creativity sparked, which is in the first phase. Then we kind of moved into the second phase of deepening those social connections, so not so much bridging, but bonding and aesthetic enrichment. That's when we went into the theatre and started to tell our stories on stage with music and lighting and having a sense of beauty and awe and wonder. And now in this third phase, we're kind of back to creativity sparked, but our social outcome has changed to agency and voice enabled. And that is a shift that's kind of a result of moving online and working separately as opposed to collectively, which we'll talk about shortly. Jez will talk about that pivot now, actually.
So when the global pandemic hit, we stared down the barrel of potentially losing $125,000 worth of public funding for the 2020 version of the Hello Project. Because our outcome was meant to be a work of collaboratively devised theatre presented at the Chuncheon Arts Festival. But in order to salvage the work, and also more than salvage the work, but to stay in contact with our newly formed ensemble of artists, we decided that we'd continue our collaborations as a series of group Zoom meetings that lead towards a collection of individual creative projects that contribute to what we're calling a digital artist book. So what we proposed to our participants, our participant artists, was that they respond to a series of questions. So we started off with a series of biographical questions, and then we encouraged our artists to start thinking about creating artist statements for themselves, capturing photos from their daily life. And the project that we're currently in the middle of is planning a portrait. And I'll just run through a couple of kind of project updates for us at the moment. So one of our participant artists, Kim Hobin, he's a prolific sportsman in Chuncheon. He's a part of a local basketball team. He's a taekwondo kind of specialist and instructor. And I don't know if you can quite read his response here, but he's talked a lot as we've got to know him over the last 2 years about how this kind of sport is his passion, sport is his life. And we've marked a real shift in his talking about his sports practice as being his arts practice. And so these kind of our raw, unedited shots that were taken in the studio last week, but he's working on a self-portrait that portrays himself as a sports artist. We have Kim Jong-son. Here we go. Chong-son. So Chong-son, one of her responses to our creative tasks was to give us a kind of a dump of photos, actually, from one of her trips to a kind of a local tourist spot. And she wrote quite poetically about the fact that she wanted to, when we could all get together, she'd want to take us there and take us around to each of the sites. So she's kind of curating this self-portrait of herself as tour guide, and it's led to some really quite beautiful shots. Kim Soo-jin is a woman who is a community leader. She's a leader in her community, and all of her responses to our kind of creative prompting have been to write very, very poetically about her life and about her goals and about her love for her family. And so she used a series of kind of Instagram filters to make herself a self-portrait. So we've been helping her realize that as an actual portrait. And I think the last one that we have here. Hello, yes. Here we go. So oh no, I've gone too far. Oh well, you would have seen the work of Lee Sung-jun, who expressed his kind of desire to one day become a social worker. So several of our artist participants are social workers and advocates and published authors and poets. and he's really kind of wanting to take his own practice in that direction. So as we've mentioned, this series, this process of checking in is one of our ways to not only maintain the health of our ensemble, but also actually create creative content. And one of the other practices that we use is reflective practice. And so as part of this project and in previous projects, we've amassed a bank of reflective prompts, which are an invaluable part of our toolkit. And actually last week, whilst kind of doing a periodic reflection on our project, we used the question that came from the title of this presentation. So how have the artistic identities of our collaborators been encouraged in this digital environment? So in this kind of final concluding part of the presentation, I'm going to tease out a couple of these points here. So I've got a question for Younghee. So this is a bit of a rehearsed, choreographed conversation, a revival of something that happened on Zoom last week. So Younghee, what have you noticed about working in the digital space as opposed to in the room?
Thank you for asking. Well, we all thought in the first year that our participants were artists and we were facilitators. In the studio, we felt like a community, but when we worked on Zoom, we moved to individual expressions and focus on the individual artist identity. Separating life from creative practice wasn't possible. The digital space reveals more of the individual creativity and individual identities. Personally, this is the most exciting change for me. This year, when we tried to introduce them as artists, there was a strong sense of denial. Very strong. It was quite a natural reaction from my perspective because in Korea, artists are considered a different class. It has something to do with elite education for arts and sports. Yeah, I was one of them. And I remember when I called myself artist about 20 years ago in front of my seniors, ex-company, theater company, I got through so much hard time. Trust me. Whew. Anyway, so however, as we carry on the project each month, our participants slowly realized that art is not something far away. Then there was a stage of epiphany, something like, oh, hang on a sec, everybody call me a good cook, great cook, so maybe cooking is my art practice. Yes, I'm a member of city basketball player and I love my taekwondo, so I can call myself an artist, something like that. Then nowadays, when we call them artists, they seem quite relaxed with their term and they are not arguing with themselves. Yes.
Younghee has a question for me.
That's right. So, Nathan, very natural. Nathan,
Very organic.
yeah. What are your thoughts on how a shift to this more individual storytelling has affected the project?
Thanks, Younghee. I agree with Younghee that this shift has encouraged more of a individual expression and built the confidence of individuals. But from more of a community development perspective, there's some red flags there with that. We're kind of shifting from a collective narrative to the individual story. So we're cautious of that. We don't want to subscribe too heavily to that neoliberal myth that it's every person for themselves. So because we're more interested in this collective story, the danger of an individual story is that it ignores the social context that you're in, especially the challenges and barriers. So when we tell our stories together, we often acknowledge those barriers and challenges more. And we're not looking for individual stories where inspirational individuals overcome those barriers. We're more interested in a collective story that we connect over and that we negotiate and then share. So that was one of the big challenges going into Zoom and asking people to work solo, basically. I'm grateful though that with this project we had 2 years of that relationship building first. So even though we're setting tasks at an individual, the bonds that were created in the last 2 years keep going. And I don't think anyone feels like they're doing this by themselves. We do group sessions of sharing, small group sessions and pair sessions. And so that sense that we're all working on something special together is still strong. And it has upsides too. People might feel valued more if their individual story is listened to and shared. And that social outcome of developing agency and voice, we've got more of a chance to do that in this environment too. But our job now is, how do we take all these individual stories and share them in a way that acknowledges that all these people are connected as a group and not strangers? And that is our challenge for the outcome or the output of this work. I like to use the metaphor of a jigsaw puzzle for this stage, where individuals are putting their own piece into the puzzle, and it will make one big picture in the end, but they can only control the piece that they're putting in. Whereas in the room, it would be more like a tapestry, and we're all interweaving this picture together. Both models encourage creativity, but in the puzzle version, you're imagining how my piece can be unique and add something meaningful to a bigger picture. But in the tapestry version, you're imagining what we could say together and how I can support others to say it. So in a way, we're lucky that we can do both. But at the core of my practice, at least, is that tapestry work. And so transitioning that online is a whole new kind of challenge for us. We're probably just about out of time. So Jez will just give a quick update about what's next for this project.
So as Younghee's mentioned, we've been successful in securing another tranche of funding from the Chuncheon City Council to extend the project into 2021. And we're planning, fingers crossed, to be located at some point in the same place once travel restrictions are lifted. And once we can be co-located, we'll be able to transition from holding space together online to creating place together. Our plan is to exhibit the work that we've created over 2020 and to put on a festival of encounters, or what Ong Keng Sen in his long-running Alter You project calls small actions, or performances of personal agency. And this kind of focus on the artistry inherent in the participants' lives and their experiences of the world kind of positions artist residencies like this one as exercises in world creating or world curating. And the 2 years, as Nathan said, of community building and artist training will put us in a really great place to do this. Especially after, as Younghee's talked about, we've worked hard to dismantle the boundaries between us and them, or us as facilitators and them as artists. In this way also, we're working within Ong Keng Sen's paradigm that positions outsiders not as teachers, which is another kind of paradigm that we've had to pull apart as part of this project, but rather sees everyone as co-participants or equal experts with different skills, either in another specialized practice or even just as experts in their own life. Thank you.
Thank you.
I've chosen today to fly solo and to sort of take the centre of the stage, just to connect with everyone in the room, and I hope my face and my spirit connects out to the people who are watching online. My name's Kathryn Kelly. If you've looked at your program, you're probably going, what is the empty space next to me, where the beautiful Emily Coleman would be? I'm afraid, as Gavin identified earlier, she is a victim of her own competence and talent. She's a senior producer with a sovereign First Nations company called DigiYouth Arts, and unfortunately it was a bit of a crisis this morning, and she's been pulled away to be fabulous there, but she sends you all her love, and to know that we worked on the slides together in the talk. And so what I'm presenting to you today, some of which is Emily's words, has been sort of negotiated and is given with full love and consent for you here today. I'd like to echo the acknowledgement of the traditional owners that Donna so eloquently offered, and Jez iterated and say that we know, we feel it. For the people that work at QUT, we feel the power of the country that we work on and its enduring footprint as a place of teaching and learning. So if we click on the slide, and I pre-organised to just wave my hand like a little ding, you'll see here that the title of today's work is Come on Sister, We're Going to Wild Country. They're not my words, they're the words of the extraordinary playwright Kathryn Watson, and they're spoken on stage in a production called Rovers by the extraordinary Roxanne MacDonald, whose face and body and image you'll get to see later on in the presentation, but who is truly one of the extraordinary First Nations performers we have in this country. So what I'm trying to talk to you about today really echoes, I think, all of the things that we've been discussing here today, which is the meaning of community. And these two case studies that I'd like to sort of talk to you about are really about how community engagement processes can really try and shift the paradigm of performance making in Australia, which has traditionally been not welcoming, not diverse, not inclusive. And I wanted to step out of, the presentation for a moment to reflect maybe on the notion and the word of community development that's been used so much here today, to kind of frame that personally. I was raised by a community development worker. My dad was one for about 50 years. And I was struck by Danya's framing of community development as part of the bureaucracy and as part of a kind of an infrastructure of urban planning. And it might be a minor point, but I suppose I wanted to offer a counter-history of that term and that word and that tradition that I know from my family and that I know Jez and my colleague Donna embodies in Australia, which is that community development is actually a Gandhian and Indian tradition. It actually comes from Indian workers working in caste at the turn of the century in India, was handed through to Gandhi, who's the proponent that we know most well. And my dad inherited it from across from a very famous Indian called Jayaprakash Narayan, who then gave it to another wonderful man called Sagarta Dasgupta, who came to live in Australia in the 1980s. But also we have a tradition via Les Halliwell, who's the most amazing academic in Sydney. So community development in Australia is about cups of tea in people's lounge rooms. It's about community halls. It really is bottom up. So I suppose I wanted to sort of put that as a star in the sky for us to say, let's not have that weasel word be held for us, because in Australia, and I think in many places, community development as a term and a practice and a tradition is actually very, very grassroots. And it's so wonderful to see Danya in the States reclaiming that and really owning that. So that's my star in the sky for us to consider. But the two projects that I want to talk to you about today are things that I've been working on now for 4 or 5 years with some people in the room, with the extraordinary Professor Sandra Gadenhoff. And I'd like to talk to you first about Rovers, which is the one that I did with them. That's very, very dear to my heart. So I'm going to ding. So you can see here a picture. And Emily Coleman, do you see that beaming face at the back? That is the lovely Em. You can see me with my squishy nose in my red shawl at Rovers. And we have the extraordinary Ani Melita Orca. And she asked us to call her Ani Melita. And she was the kind of the elder that was at the heart of this process. And she brought with us and introduced us to, and this was a great honour, her Cherbourg Dormitory sisters, which is Ani Estelle in the purple beanie, and Ani Berenice. And as 3 young girls, they lived together in the Cherbourg Dormitories, which is a community in the Burnett Valley, Gubbi Gubbi country, that was a reserve. So there's a long story that I won't go into now about that, but for the Australians in the room, you'll probably have a context on that. Then my colleagues Cinnamon Smith and Danielle Shenke. So you see here something that you wouldn't often see on Australian stages, and that's First Nations and white people together in equal proportion and linked in connection and touch, which was really what we wanted for the project. Ding! And you see here an elders table that Emily is convening, where the First Nations audience members who came had their own space at the Brisbane Festival. So I wanted to start by giving you a context on Emily, because she's not here. If we were here, I'd say, over to Emily, and she would talk to you about who she is. So she's a proud Bundjalung Githabul woman, and at the heart of her practice is ancestral connection and respect to elders. We're so lucky to have had her at QT, but I have to say QT Acting and Drama has the most extraordinary tradition of creating First Nations artists. We can claim both the Enochs, Wesley and Leanne, Wayne Blair, Deborah Malman, and these are artists not just of influence and talent, but of great generosity, and whose contributions to First Nations and to performance making in Australia is unparalleled. So Em very, very deeply feels her connections to her ancestors, and I think really feels like she's working in that tradition that we're so lucky to have here at QT. I am a dramaturg, and you'll be like, what is that if you're not in theatre? Dramaturgy is also a beautiful and long-standing tradition of truth-telling and of advocacy and of intervention in culture and of general rat-baggery. So Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, who was an Enlightenment playwright and kind of cultural provocateur, so he almost went to jail a number of times, because he believed in an idea of religious toleration. So he believed in the 18th century that Islam, Judaism and Christianity should be treated equally, which was a radical position at that time. So he actually began a whole series of things. He was the first person to take theatre companies and to communicate with audiences. So up until that point, if you were going to the theatre in Germany and most places, they would bang a hole in the door, and on there would be a piece of paper, and it would tell you what the show was, and it would tell you what was for dinner in the buffet, served in the foyer after the show, which was almost more important than what was on at the show. Lessing said, I want to actually communicate with people. I think that theatre, as the primary cultural form, has a responsibility to intervene in all of the big issues of the day, which at that time was unification of Germany, which was religious toleration, a whole range of things. So the word dramaturgy, which he coined, which he created, is actually the notion of an artist as a facilitator brokering the communication between an institution or a theatre experience and the community, and making sure that the work that you make actually changes and impacts the audiences and the communities that you're dealing with. So I happen to teach here as well, which is delightful. And I also am company dramaturg with an all-female company called Blue Creative, and Rovers was our show. Ding! So Rovers arose out of relationship and serendipity, which I think we can attest from what we've discussed is actually the most authentic and interesting and powerful way to begin any process that actually might activate real change. So you see here Barbara Lowing and Roxanne McDonald, two extraordinary performers. Barb had not had a gig in 18 months. No one had given her a job. Because when you're an older female performer in Australia, there are no roles, there are no opportunities. After decades of self-sacrifice, of nurturing other performers, Barb was in despair. So we said, right, we're going to write you a show. We're going to try and give you an economic vehicle so that you're not reliant on other people to actually create work. You can actually take it on the road, you can do what you want. At the same time, our artistic director, Carolyn Dunphy, encountered Roxanne McDonald, who is literally the face of First Nations performance in Brisbane, to discover that she was working as a security guard in a hospital and walking 25 kilometres a night just to make ends meet. We were like, this is outrageous. Coincidentally, we discovered that Barb and Rox were old friends, but had not been cast together on a theatre stage in Australia since the 90s. Now, this is a shameful indictment of the unspoken white privilege and segregation of the Australian performing sector. So briefly, in the halcyon period of the 90s, and we've all remembered that, because I think most of us, well, most of us do. They starred in a Taming of the Shrew that had equal First Nations and non-First Nations cast that toured to Uluru. And they drank oysters. They drank champagne and ate oysters that they'd bought at Uluru and didn't die of food poisoning, but had the most extraordinary time. Rox describes making Barb hide in the back seat so they could get free entry to the national park at Uluru by pretending that Barb was, not there because white people had to pay. So we decided we would build a show about these two extraordinary women, about their ancestors. So you see them there portraying the ancestrals, about memory, about aging, about the sacrifices that they had made. But how can you make a show with a First Nations and a non-First Nations artist and know that when you put it on, only white people are going to show up? Because I am afraid to say, click the slide, that although there has been an absolute resurgence, a cultural resurgence of First Nations performance we haven't seen the like of since the 1990s. Although there has finally been an acknowledgement by Mainstage that they need to commission people of colour, maintain gender parity, do a whole range of other things, offer people with a disability and artists an opportunity. Although we've finally got maybe somewhere with programming, we still have, I believe, some of the most inequitable access to the infrastructure, i.e. the performance venues in the country. So when you look at the government investment, the footprint in the cement, the buildings that they build, and you look at other sectors, libraries, museums, a whole range of things, you see that there are all sorts of communities engaging. There's a real sense of ownership, or more anyway. When you look at the venues, the large performing arts venues, and you take photos like this one of their opening nights and of who's using them, it's very much like that first presentation we saw where, it's an incredibly monocultural and often upper middle class activity. So we were like, right, we can't put on this show in all conscience, pardon me, without actually thinking about how we make sure that the audiences are actually diverse. And in this case, we need audiences of First Nations people if they want to come see the show. Thanks, Donna. I think it's dusty up here. To feel comfortable and to feel culturally safe and welcomed. Pardon me. Now, I am a middle-aged white lady. I'm not going to make anyone feel culturally safe and welcomed, however much I smile. I can try. In fact, I sometimes put people off with my desire to hug them. Laughter in the room for people who know me, who've watched me kind of, emote over people much to their despair. I was raised by a community development worker. It's not my fault. I was handed around at parties from birth to cuddle everyone who came. So again, understanding that what we've done is work through relationship and serendipity, I reached back to Em, who, as Gavin attests, it was one of the extraordinary undergrads that we had. And I asked her if she would want to come and partner with me. So what we did with Rovers was not come up with a program, but we went via relationship. So we talked about it with Em, what should we do? And we went to visit the Brisbane Festival. And we said, here's what we want to do. And they were quite extraordinary. They said to us, okay, have some tickets. So we're like, oh. And then Em and I were talking about how we could actually develop networks and sort of give her an extended period of time to work back and to create community. So if we go tick, dun, 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 rather than me telling you about it, dun, 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 tick again, we're going to go to the video of Em and I talking about what we were going to do. So you get a little bit of the joy that is Emily Coleman. Over to our tech people. Hi, I'm Kath.
Hi, I'm Emily.
And we're here to discuss Baloo's engagement project for Rovers.
Yeah.
So we have a tranche of tickets that were given to us by the Brisbane Festival.
and we hired Emily to help develop links into the community and to distribute the tickets.
Yeah, so basically I reach out to the community members, both young people who want to come to the theatre and, more importantly, significant community elders who haven't had any experience going to the theatre, and we're bringing them in to diversify our audiences.
Yeah, and Emily will also be a welcome
Yes.
for our audience members
Yeah,
as well.
so when people come to the show, I'm the face that they come to, I'm the face that they know, and I can welcome them to the theatre and just make them feel comfortable, make sure they're not just chucked in the deep end.
That's awesome. And for every show that Baloo does, we try and do this, don't we, Emily? We try and mentor young artists like Emily, and we try and make sure that we reach out and have a kind of conversation or build relationships and experiences for our audience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For me, as an Indigenous person, I think that our involvement and our voices are very important and should be heard and included, and not just an afterthought. They need to be part of the process, and they need to be included respectfully and deeply. Yeah, passionately.
So the lessons from Rovers, and we'll tick, were absolutely joyous. So on opening night, when Auntie Melita came with the Sherberg Dormitory sisters, she looked around the room, she said, "Oh my God, there's so many blackfellas here. What's going on?" She loved it so much she came back, which was amazing. She came back for another performance. We had a VIP for the elders in the front seat. The health minister was there at the same time, and he thought that the VIP things were for him. And it was a gestalt moment when we had to usher the health minister away so that the First Nations elders could take their place at the front. We had the whole Indigenous Advisory Committee that we'd worked with from the Brisbane Festival there as well. It was a room of First Nations and non-First Nations people together watching this show. We hired some First Nations filmmakers to do vox pops in the audience for us, and there was quite an extraordinary and rich discourse about how the show read for the First Nations audience and how it read then for the kind of the white audience. Em then went on and took the model and worked in an All First Nations production called From Darkness at La Boite, and of course got picked up by Digi Youth Arts and is off and away. We're also going to roll out the program, and this is going to be really interesting, with regional venues when it goes on national tour next year, which was meant to happen this year but didn't, of course, due to COVID. And then we've been working with our First Nations cultural consultant on the show, Nadine McDonald-Dowd, because we've done web series as well. Em, in her learnings, really, I guess, felt, she describes having to shift between, I think, exactly that kind of quote-unquote white professional mode back into community and what that meant for her. One of the big obstacles to the process was quite, in a benign way, the Brisbane Festival wanted a database. So they wanted the names and addresses and whatever of the people. And whenever we tried to, at the early stage of the process, enact that, the whole project ground to a halt. So we just went back to the Brisbane Festival and went, no, the database is Em. The database is the relationship she holds for as long as she wants to hold them. If she takes them somewhere else, that's exactly what it should be. And then suddenly we had too many people and not enough tickets, which was amazing. For me, and if we click on, the learnings were the sadness that although we had brought all the people in the room together from these two communities, we'd actually finally had what we wanted, which was a collaboration between First Nations and non-First Nations artists, witnessed by an audience, that those two communities didn't at all intersect in the space. There was no sense from what we can tell, we didn't ask the questions. It was the First Nations filmmakers who asked. There was no sense of, that we understood, of a lack of safety. In fact, people from the First Nations community who came felt very held and felt like they had their own space and their own person in them to keep them safe as well as a space. But we didn't know how to broker how those two audience communities would talk. And I think that's probably the biggest and most sort of complicated work of the project as it continues. And then this was my kind of, I guess, learning. And I guess if I think about it, it's these last two lines that really, I think, are important for all of us. And that's, scarcity is no justification for inaction. Small is powerful. Relationships are all. We can always do better. We will always fail. We are better together. Thank you.
The first academic kind of conference or symposium that's running ahead of time ever. And I was part of a symposium last year and we ran so wildly behind time. I think I've overcorrected today, but I don't think anyone ever complains about things moving quickly. Well, I certainly don't. Okay. So I feel really just wildly grateful and fortunate and just incredibly privileged to just be here today. And I think, you know, starting off with Danya's keynote and then hearing my colleagues who I share a research group with just feels so, I don't know, I just feel as though this is where I'm meant to be, and I'm just really grateful for that. And I feel as though I'll probably be repeating some stuff that everyone's already said, but I guess that's why we all collaborate together and why we've banded together as a group of people, because our values, and Danya brought that up about, you know, trying to put values first, and I think that that's really so much of what I've heard today. So I'm going to talk, I think it's about process really, is what, when I think about the sorts of things I'm going to talk about today, and when I put it in context with what I've heard, there's kind of a lot of process and what I've learned along the way. So it's about creative community engagement, and I guess that's what I kind of say that I do. And you know, I do creative community engagement, and I have an amazing collaborator who does impact assessment, and we kind of think about how we do those bookends. But what we really do is we have the privilege of working with communities to find out with them ways that they would like to articulate and share what their community means to them, and also what the capacity is in those communities, what the creativity of those communities might look like, and also what kind of support they would like to see to help them elevate and amplify who they are and what they want for their futures. And I think something that also Danya brought up, and she talked about that consultation process that happened at the beginning of the High Line, and I've walked the High Line, and it is just such a stunning, beautiful experience. But it's so true. People walking the High Line look like me. They're middle class, they're white. It does not look like the community there, and it was just so fascinating to hear some of that story. But when Danya talked about that consultation process, and that's part of when I think about creative community engagement that I wanted to move away from, because I had done what had been thought of as consultation projects before, and what that always tended to look like was exactly that. You come in, you ask opinions, and then the funding bodies just completely ignore whatever it was that had been, you know, and communities knew that, and they really resented being consulted because it meant nothing. And they were often consulted in ways that felt really kind of inappropriate, felt really removed from who they are. But also, really, what happened was that the people who consulted were the same people all the time. And I talked about this with a fairly major philanthropic organisation about maybe some of the issues of consulting in communities is that when you only talk to the council, that you're going to hear the same things over and over again and then feel really baffled as to why the funding and the projects that you're putting into communities don't have the outcomes that you want, aren't really welcomed and taken up by the communities. So I was lucky enough a couple of years ago to have a fellowship overseas, and I'd done some sort of consultation. I tried to do them differently, projects, and I was lucky enough to have a fellowship in the States with the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum, and they had a really specific process around engagement and co-design that they did with their communities, and I went there and observed that and was kind of really embedded in some of those processes, and have been able to come back and then work with communities to redesign some of that into a creative engagement process that moves a little bit away from that co-design process. So, what is creative community engagement? It sort of defies definition and is really more able to be described, but for me it's a process, and it's, you know, the outcomes differ from project to project. It's never the same, the process is never the same. It differs from community to community, but what it has always at the heart of it is that it centres the voices of that community and it privileges their lived experiences. And I think it was Jeremy who talked about people, you know, saying that they're the experts on their own experiences, and that's part of what, when we go in to do those engagement processes, we talk about you are the experts on your community, you are the experts of your own experiences. So the engagement process tries to make all of that at the centre of it. And then what it tries to do also is to find creative and arts-based ways to develop and co-develop a language that works for that community, for them to talk about themselves in a way that feels really meaningful for them. And it's always really deeply rooted in place. And there's a Tasmanian philosopher called Jeff Malpass, who talks about that place is integral to the very structure and possibility of experience. There's no possibility of understanding human experience, especially human thought and experience, other than understanding it through place. And so for the projects I'm going to talk about is that we really know that identity, a sense of belonging, culture, hope, trauma and potential are all tied very much to place. So, the thing about place is that when you ask people to talk about it, the language changes dramatically. So when I'm doing an engagement and I'm wanting to understand a community and understand an environment and a place, that the most useful way for me to start thinking about that is to really broaden the idea of what data collection might look like, what's information mean, and what is it that I'm wanting to know and how I might feed that back to whoever it is who's funding the project. And so I started thinking about when I'm asked to talk about place, and particularly places that are really precious, really deeply a part of who I am. I immediately start thinking in terms of senses. I think about how it feels. What's the weather like? What does it smell like? What are the sounds like? And then I start to think about the feelings. So some of you might already know, this is a photograph of a road that leads out of the town that I grew up in. So, Roma. And it looks like that. And I went back a few years ago, and I'll talk about this project a bit later. And I was driving around, and I hadn't been back for a really long time. And like most people who grew up in small country towns, I spent the first 17 years of my life just dreaming of ways to get out of there. And of course, you know, now I find myself just finding reasons to go back to it, which is really odd. But when I first went back, I hadn't been back for a while, and I was driving around and just completely flooded with feelings, and it was about place. There was nobody really left in the town that I knew. It wasn't that kind of human thing. It was just the place was in my bones. And I stopped here and took the photograph because I used to ride my bike just endlessly around, you know, up and down there. And when I started thinking about if someone asked me to describe what was that place like, the words that came up were like heat, hope, boredom, and thinking about a future and also feeling scared. And so suddenly I had all of these feelings again, and I couldn't really describe the place, but I was talking about who I am in place, and what place made me, and maybe the bits of myself that I might have left in that place. So, when I do community engagement projects, and the part of the process is understanding people in place, who they are in that place, how that place has helped make them, and the ways in which place is tied to their future and also tied to their past as well. So, when is this useful? I'm stuck in place. There we go. So, when is this a particularly useful kind of process? Thinking about all of those ways of working with communities around finding new languages, finding arts-based and creative languages, and also thinking about place-based approaches to who we are and how we think about our futures. For underserved and underrepresented communities, traditional ways of consulting and traditional ways of doing data collection can not only be inappropriate, they can be intimidating, and they can be tied to feelings of being surveilled, and that by not answering questions the right way, by not providing the right kinds of questions, that some part of their security might be in danger. So when you go into communities that already feel as though they are over-policed, that they are underheard, and you start handing out surveys or saying, come into the council, sit in a circle and let me ask you questions, you're rarely going to get really the kind of information that you want that's going to be useful, and you're certainly not going to build that kind of relationship. And some of the things that Danya talked about were I found really powerful, and a couple of them, and also when she was talking about them, I had those moments of going, I've done that, and it felt really embarrassing. One was that sense of urgency as opposed to working at the pace of trust. For most of us who work in projects, we know that it's really difficult to completely circumvent timelines. So it's really hard to not do that. And I know the numbers of times that I've kind of barreled in and tried to hurry stuff up, and that never works very well. So part of the way to mitigate that has been to make the processes feel a little bit more gentle. We still work within a timeline, but instead of asking questions, doing some arts-based projects instead, and arts-based activities helps to slow that down, even though we're still working at a particular pace. So that helps. The other thing about creative community consultation, I'm going to give some examples in a minute, is that research shows that arts-based methods enable a communication between different sectors of society and also challenges power structures. So once you take the language out of that kind of dominant white supremacist language and allow a new language to emerge, then immediately you're saying we're really disrupting and destabilising the idea of expert, of outsider, insider, of person who's in charge, who's the boss, who's gathering information, who are the subjects, and who are the people who have agency in the relationship. It also helps to create a safe symbolic space. And the first project I want to talk about is a really good example of that, creating a safe symbolic space. So this was a project that I worked with the wonderful Robert, that's his empty chair I'm pointing to. The wonderful Robert, we did a project together with Milperra State High School, and Milperra State High School is an English language intensive high school in Brisbane that is for refugee and asylum seeker young people to build their English language skills. English is often their third, second or fourth language, to build those English language skills before they then move into a mainstream high school. We did this project because it was funded by Education Queensland, and the team ended up being a psychologist and someone from creative arts. And the reason that they ended up, it was like we were kind of at the bottom, it's like, God, nothing else has worked, so let's get health and arts in. And the reason for that was that what Education Queensland knew was that Milperra State High School had the best practice around building inclusive classrooms for culturally and linguistically diverse young people. They knew that whatever they were doing there was working, that when those students transitioned into mainstream high schools, they really thrived in ways that other culturally and linguistically diverse young people didn't. People, young people whose English language skills were actually higher than the people who come from Milperra. And they wanted to understand why that was. And they had done some projects where they'd looked at the curriculum, they'd looked at the pedagogy, and they still didn't seem to really understand what it was that was occurring at Milperra. So we thought that maybe the arts might help. And Robert and his colleague Nagar had already done a series of tests and interventions where they understood the levels of resilience within that school, similar to the sorts of processes he was talking about when he was working with the women, refugee women, where he already understood that the levels of resilience of the young people in that school were much higher than young people from non-traumatic, non-refugee backgrounds. And so they knew where we were starting. We wanted to kind of understand how Milperra may have helped to support and facilitate an environment that really allowed the young people to flourish and allowed that resilience to really show itself. So what we understood was that instead of going in and asking, how does Milperra, create inclusive classrooms, what does that look like? We thought about it and we thought, look, this is about belonging. So let's talk with the community about what belonging means. And let's also try and have a really holistic view of what that means for this community. So we'll talk to the students, we'll talk to their caregivers and their community members, and we'll also talk to the school and staff community. And so we set up 3 workshops, and I still remember this really well, that I had said to Nagar and Robert, we had never worked together before, and I said, I'm going to do a workshop, I'm going to talk about belonging, and we've got lots of paper and pencils, and I've brought some objects, I've brought this kind of egg cup from my childhood, and all of these things, and just sit back and then you can join in as participants once we get going a little bit. And so I started talking about what belonging meant to me, what the smells were that are associated with belonging. I talked about this particular egg cup that I'd carried with me throughout my life and why that made me always think about belonging and my family. And I could see Robert and Nagar's faces at the back of the room going, what's she doing? And we had a short break and Nagar said to me, when are the surveys coming out? What are the things, I don't understand how you're measuring this, what are you doing? I said, look, you just have to go with it, you just have to trust me. So, and then I had that moment going, oh my God, what am I doing? And so we had this really wonderful workshop where the young people drew pieces of jewellery that had been handed down to them. They talked about particular dishes that their families had made, and they were able to talk about those things that helped them to feel like they still belonged, even though they felt as though they weren't in their country of origin. So we had a whole lot of really wonderful data that looked like pictures and notes about someone having hot chips and Fanta on a Saturday morning, and from that we're able to do a series. Then we talked to the parents and caregivers, and from that we're able to do a series of digital stories that were able to elaborate on this idea of belonging and how Milperra was able to put that into practice. So, but we started with the word belonging, allowed them to say what that meant for them, and then extrapolate that out into the environment we needed to talk about. That's been used by other schools now. We've made a toolkit as well, so how other schools can help to foster that sense of belonging, and that is by really privileging that first culture and starting from that point and allowing that school to understand what they can learn from those students rather than the other way around. Now, quickly, this is another project, and this is Roma. This is where the road led out of. And a couple of years ago, I went out there and I went to the state high school that I'd actually graduated from, and to talk to the young people about what kinds of creative skills they would like to develop. The funding body wanted to understand how they could put programs into that community that would develop skills for young people. It has the highest youth unemployment rate in the country. And so what we did was, again, we started talking about what's creativity mean for that community. what does community mean? What do they love the most about where they are? And it was always the people. And what it is that when they think about their future, what's the exciting part of that and what's the scary part of that for them? And so what came out of that project really, really clearly was that young people wanted to stay in their community. They didn't want to be another generation that had to leave to find jobs. And that they also talked about wanting to do things like interior design, like theatre design, and that they wanted to be taught those skills in place and to keep those skills in place. And so part of what we did was we asked them to get together and design their ideal artistic or creative event. And then we were able to, from that, then start to break down what were the skills that were needed for that and how might they be able to have those developed and what would that look like. And it meant someone coming in and spending time in their community for them to grow in place rather than needing to go out of place to grow. And the very last one I want to talk about this is a project that Sandra and I and Helen Claby are working on. It's an ARC linkage project, and it's the social impact of it's the Creative Arts in Regional Australia, a social impact model. We started last year, and this year we had a whole slate of fabulous community engagement that we were going to do with our partners, and we were so excited. And I think we ended up cancelling 9 or 10 flights for this year once COVID hit. But what we didn't want to do was just put on ice that relationship building. And we needed to find ways to be able to start to do some of that community engagement, which was about understanding the place and the people and the creativity of that place. So we put together a digital engagement strategy, which sounds a lot fancier than it really was. We thought about what it was that we were going to be doing in the community. What were the things that we wanted to understand about that community, and how might we design some creative activities that would help us to get some of that information. The long and the short of this is that part of it was wildly successful. Some of the activities and the questions that we posed to the community was so much more successful than we imagined, and some were wildly unsuccessful. And the clearest way for me to understand that is when we were completely not part of it, when even the questions that we're asking and the activities we're asking them to do was about them, and all we did was just give a prompt, it was really successful. When I started to design questions that were so clearly moving people in particular ways and started to clearly have something that I wanted to know at the end of it, in some of the questions, nobody answered them. And in the ones where we let people do everyone, we had like 70 or 80 people answer them. So it became really obvious that I have a lot to learn about how to get out of the way in communities, and also how to just allow communities to speak for themselves rather than to continue to kind of find ways to get in there and kind of work out what it is that we need to know. So yes, I think that's the end of it. Is that the best thing that we've learnt this year, or I've learnt this year, is just, to get out of the way. Thank you.
That was fantastic. Thanks, Donna. I love that little quote there that I was reading. As a musician and someone who's worked in community, I can really relate to that. What was it someone said? My partner and I wrote songs on the weekend. They're not going to be at the top of the charts anytime soon. But basically that meant a lot to us. I can really relate to it. It seemed like it was really good. That's a really powerful argument for the kind of things we're talking about today. It was fantastic. I have been tapping away here, but I haven't been being rude. I've been talking to all my friends. There's a lot of people that I know who I'd like to be talking to on Zoom as well. So we've been chatting away there. So all you Zoomers, I won't call out specific names yet, but all you Zoomers, if you have any questions for the presenters, even if you only managed to duck in and see one presenter earlier and then you had to go away and come back, feel free to ask questions. I'm looking at the Zoom chat now. And I was doing one other thing, which is writing questions myself. I don't know how we want to do this. Do the presenters maybe want to come on stage and can rotate around this microphone then? I'll start things off here with one question that really stood out to me after the first two presentations from Robert, who's ducked off.
He'll be back.
I'll ask this question anyway, and I'll ask it of Company Bad. Something that really stood out in the kind of dialogue in your project there was about this relationship between the individual and the collective, and in a way that's really a theme that underpins a lot of this kind of work that we do. We're kind of talking about almost a sense of loss there through COVID in having to do things that we do so intuitively in an embodied way. How are there ways that we can still try and create that sense of embodiedness and connection and community in the digital online space through, you know, these ideas of digital communities and so on? Or is it just fundamentally different? Will there always be something that is just lost? Or can we think around it differently to try and create what we feel we're losing?
I can start, and then if anyone wants to add, yeah, we have lost our biggest tool, which is being in the same room, and that is a big change. But even when we're not in the same room, it's still our real life, and we're still meeting each other. In terms of embodied practice, we had to relearn everything we already knew about facilitation. We knew that we needed to take a break during a workshop, but when we got on Zoom, we forgot. And we knew that we knew we had to do some kind of icebreaker or warm up, and then we got on Zoom and we forgot. And we knew that if we just talked for 2 hours amongst ourselves, we would lose interest from the group. So it was really surprising to me how much we forgot when we got on Zoom. But I think for our project, we were lucky in that community was already established and we didn't have to try and do that online. It was transferred over. And luckily, some of them were already great friends prior to our process starting. We relearned that using music, moving our body, talking while living your life, you know, telling us a story while preparing a duck was one of my favorite examples. You know, doing things that use the body and the senses, even though you're on Zoom, helped to make it a special shared experience as opposed to another time where we're trying to communicate through Zoom. So yeah, our constant challenge was how can we make this feel special, which is kind of aesthetic enrichment. How can we make this an artistic experience with joy and wonder and emotions and the body and beliefs and culture, even though we're all separate and on Zoom. So I think the day that we realized, oh, we can play music, that was a breakthrough. It's like, oh, of course we can play music and that can take us somewhere. So yeah, that's kind of what I have to add to that. Anyone else?
Only a small thing, like we discovered a different kind of collective space. So when we're working inside a rehearsal studio or inside a theatre, we're all separately, individually coming together into the same space. But on Zoom, and this is something that Kath and I have written about, like in a teaching context, we're actually we're collectively experiencing each other's private spaces, and the boundaries, like it just it magnifies so much more. Like Nathan mentioned in the presentation, this idea that you actually like leaving your shit at the door, especially in a community creative context. Like it's not possible because we're actually inside people's homes watching them prepare a duck, or so somebody that really didn't want to miss out on the session, and so we've watched them get in a taxi and go to a doctor's appointment and then get back into the taxi, and 2 hours later they're back in their home. So all of that stuff, and seeing the way that people live their lives in a way that you don't get to see when you're working in a studio. So it's that kind of collectivization of the private space, which is really fascinating.
I might add to it. Jess and I've talked about it. Zoom, what is real in the world on Zoom looks faker sometimes
than what is actually presenting. So people sometimes try and curate their personal spaces for Zoom, and that can often look more artificial. So it's a sort of it's a new semiotics, I guess, to be all wanky and academic. And then how do you break through the boxes are so fascistic, like they don't blur or change. So the conclusion that we came to is actually embodiment. So the only thing that can kind of trigger the Zoom is if you move, and faces and obliques, and there's all sorts of things that you can actually do. And I'm particularly interested in how you disrupt the functionality buttons. So everyone goes off mute now. They put their mute on and they just disengage. So I'm like, what guerrilla things can we do in our teaching next year to actually play with some of those conventions that people have so quickly taken to basically cut their own engagement off, to sort of numb their bodies as a participant of Zoom. So I think our agenda is, let's embody Zoom. Like, let's see if we can actually use our performance practices to take it on.
Just really echoing what everyone else has said. When we first started having to do everything on Zoom, and it was exactly like that, it was just felt exhausting and really draining and soul destroying. And then I had the lovely experience, and I think Sandra did too. There's an organisation we've been planning to do a project with called the National Rural Health Alliance, and they were having a Friends of the Alliance, what I thought was going to be a meeting on it. And it was a whole bunch of people all having morning tea in their homes, and people showing their scones and their lamingtons and dogs, and this is my favourite plant, and this is my garden. And it just reminded me, so it was all like rural doctors and talking about the weather, and everyone said what country they were working from. And it just was this moment of going, it doesn't have to be like the way we've been doing it here. It can be like that, where it can actually make us closer to each other. And then someone pulled out a guitar and sang a song as well, and somebody then just raced and got a triangle, and they're playing the triangle, and thought, this is what Zoom can do. But we don't do that very well here. They do it better. Yet.
2021's job.
Yeah.
Yes, with Zoom latency, we know how in time that triangle was, but it's okay. There's some really good responses there. Another thing that I think I'll pick up that was a common theme in the presentations and in yours as well, Kath, was this idea of place, which Donna kind of ended off with. And obviously there's very conspicuous geographical places in many ways. And in yours, Kath, I couldn't help but see that the theatre space there, and knowing what happens with Theatre Republic as a place, a really specific place that has its own boundaries, and some visible and some invisible. So through all of these different projects, place was really interesting, and we're kind of talking about virtual place there, or how Zoom changes place as well. I wonder if anyone has any kind of thoughts about that, since Donna finished off with that very explicitly, but it was really more implicit in your talks.
About public spaces like theatre foyers and
as a place, or as a place that you make through that
Absolutely.
You're making through your work.
Yeah, well, they're amazing because they're temporary theatre foyers and in the moment, and that's what theatre makers. That's what we love, is the sense of something passing. But I think to sort of echo, just as looking at all of Danya's amazing maps, I wanted to sort of throw something in that I'm sure Jez and Nathan know. But there's actually a project in Ozstage that has mapped as much as possible within the kind of context of two kind of cultures coming together, the fact that most of the performing arts centres that we have are built on First Nations performance spaces. So I was reminded of this when the Campus to Country strategy came out, and thinking about that space of the Theatre Republic. In many ways, the little kind of work that Em was doing in that space was almost trying to call up what was underneath the concrete. and not by digging the concrete up, but by sort of filling it with spaces. And I should have showed you some of the vox pops, because what M set up little stations for people, little corners and places where they could come to, the First Nations audience members could come in community. And she would then, at the elder space, she would then bring one by one the younger artists and people that had come to see the show, and they would yarn, and Em would sort of curate all of that. So I think even in our temporary spaces of performance and theatre, what we have to start thinking about as white artists is how we can support First Nations artists to support their communities, but for also to help us understand that kind of the earth underneath the concrete that we've placed on it.
No other takers. I've been encouraging online questions here. I even pulled out my great Ferris Bueller's Day Off joke by saying Bueller. We don't have any takers yet. I promise I won't mention names. Oh, we have one. Thank you. So John Meyer has a question for Donna, and he asked. This leads off quite nicely from what you were saying at the end there about having to really open up your methods quite radically. And he says, was there a specific outcome that you wanted for the Roma project that you were aiming for? This idea of outcomes-driven work, something we deal with a lot, and it's really interesting to ask. Was there specific outcomes that either you wanted or that the project was meant to report on, or the community wanted, or...
That's a really good question, because that was a particularly interesting and I think a rare experience, because it was funded by a philanthropic body who weren't entirely sure. What they wanted was they wanted some suggestions about how they could improve their processes, and that they were willing for me to experiment with communities. So it wasn't just Roma, there were some others, but the one in Roma was particularly, I think, gave some of the best feedback to that organisation. So we were allowed to explore how best to engage with communities. So, and with that community, they were interested in how to support young people there, and they were, I think they're probably thinking about, employment strategies and stuff like that. And we ended up talking about putting on comedy shows and learning how to do makeup for theatre and stuff, which ended up, for them, really made them have to go, we're asking the wrong questions about how do we support communities and young people, because what we're not doing is asking them who are they and what are they interested in, and how could we then help to match them up with mentors who can go out and be in community and work with them, rather than thinking about really explicit kind of employment kinds of projects. So we were really fortunate that we were given that kind of latitude with that. But one of the outcomes of that was a toolkit that we created across 3 different communities, and the toolkit sort of shifted differently with the cohorts about how might you facilitate a series of activities that allow communities to talk in the ways that they want to, and also is useful for funding bodies as well. So that was the outcome, but that was a rare project where it was just a lot of experimenting.
That's a great. The outcome there actually is how do you ask the right questions, and it becomes really a place-specific way of creating change. That's fantastic. And obviously, actually, when I think about it, that is an arts-based method that absolutely reflects how you work in your theatre work, with this kind of radical openness to what people bring. Really interesting. I think I saw something else click up just here. Sophie is off. Thank you, Sophie. Thank you for coming. She's going to watch the recordings that she missed as well. So there's been some of our great colleagues from QUT and around Australia online here. I have another question here, which is about audiences. So this was something that's quite interesting, the idea of engaging audiences, the idea of what audiences are, if we even have audiences for this kind of work. Sometimes, I don't know, maybe you can think, maybe you could start off talking about that, Kath, since that was a big part of your project, was dealing with this idea of audience engagement.
Sandra can probably back me up with the more accurate statistics, but the recent Australia Council information is that there has been, I think, a fourfold increase in expressed in the population of samples, which I think they sampled 7,000 Australians, in attending First Nations cultural events. So, Jazz and I are writing an article about the kind of the rise of the influence of Asian practice at the moment too, and there's a similar description that suddenly, at a kind of cultural tipping point, the appetite for arts content that's kind of coming from a community by the sort of general public just rises, as well as the arts practices. And it's the artists that are often the brokers between that. And so what we're seeing at the moment, which is so exciting, is, so someone like Alethea Beatson's describing it, we're seeing sovereign First Nations companies rising, many of which that have been around for a long time, like Abudjeri, that came out of the Black Theatre movement in the 70s, taking control, like First Nations-led, producing content, sending stuff out, and being met for the first time with actual audience interest. So if you talk to a programmer, even 5 or 6 years ago, you would get a very dismissive idea of there being a quote-unquote audience. I think the work that needs to be done, though, is similar to what Em was kind of describing. People don't just go to the theatre off the top of their head. It's a white system. They actually need support, and they need welcome, and they need some of those sort of obstacles that I think Danya described. Did you see the worship of words? Did that? I was like, that struck to my very heart, because I worship words. And but it's true. All the words I love, who knows whether I even understand them. I just love them. I just worship them. So how do we actually, in terms of audience, understanding that we're at a cultural tipping point, we genuinely are, super exciting, where there's content rising, there's sovereign-based First Nations artists willing to really get feisty with us too, like they're taking no prisoners in many respects. There's audience appetite, but the concrete walls stay the same. I mean, my parents struggle to get their way into QPAC as a cultural venue. So there's I think the sort of invisible, unspoken dramaturgical or engagement work really of this next period is how do we help people walk through the door safely?
So our project, well, last year we did a small scale of showcases twice, and mostly our audience were like friends and families and skatholders and funders and strangely there are a few like city councilwomen and parliament members and news reporters and so on. The part of it because the last few years like disability art became a new trend in Korea, so there are lots of monies hanging around. So there were lots of like big gigs, like a huge choreographer worked with a group of disability community, and it just became one big event. So our project kind of like, they are weird and strange, and they look like they're doing nothing for 5 hours, but the participants really satisfy about the whole process. So what is this? So many researchers also came along. But however, I think this, ever since we shifted to digital space, we're hoping that our audience can be extended, because anyone can actually access to our work in the end. And I remember last showcase, there's like pretty much more than double amount of audiences in the theater, and there were just so many different types of audience, not just disability community in Chuncheon, but quite a few people came along from Seoul and other cities, and so many other politicians too. So it is fascinating audience group for our project, but yeah, hopefully we can actually reach to more broad audience in Korea and beyond Korea by our digital work. Is there anything you want to top up?
Just that, just that the like that kind of shift. It's kind of the same similar shift that happened, from the large intercultural theatre events of the 70s, 80s, early 90s, and going towards the more long scale engagement, long scale partnerships. And so actually we learned, I guess, how to work in community because we learned how to work together in this kind of transcultural way. One of the things that's been really lovely to witness is our artists actually kind of owning that artistic identity. So there's a big question from some of our artists, even a couple of months ago when we started this round of the creative development, like really worrying about whether audiences would take them seriously, and whether, and the surprise that artists who live with disabilities outside of, Chuncheon's quite a small town, but whether artists who live with disabilities are taken seriously by audiences. And some of the things that we did was to showcase the work of Back to Back, for example, who, are not an incredible ensemble with a long history of work that actually our production partners had arranged their Korean tour. So, we were able to share these stories of these are people who have an artistic identity, and we can actually share an artistic identity together, and there is an audience for it, and to be able to actually demonstrate that, well, actually, even in Chuncheon, there is, like Younghee described, there is quite an audience for work. I didn't have a fully formed point, but there you go.
That's some really good comments there, and certainly we're in a space now as well where that idea of audience really can be blown apart, and we don't necessarily need to have this division between audience and performers a lot of the time, and I think your work kind of does encapsulate that at various points. Younghee, I really like this idea that people would look and say, what are you doing for 5 hours? It brings me to something that Donna said, which was about the importance of pace. So I started asking a question about space or place, but also pace, this idea of changing timelines and temporality in the work that we're doing, having to be much more flexible and less teleological, less goal-oriented in that way. Does anyone have any comments on that?
Yeah, I'll just kind of build on what we were talking about just earlier, is that when you use friendship as a methodology, whether it's a research methodology or a creative methodology, the project has to take the pace of friendship. We've probably all had these experiences of having these kind of like one night stand relationships with people, not in a sexual sense, but you meet someone and you go, oh yeah, we're going to get on forever, let's make Facebook friends, and then like you never see them again. And a lot of community development work feels like that. It's like the one night stand approach. And it's great for a weekend, but after that, what are you left with apart from some blurry photos, which is also a lot of creative development, creative community work is a series of blurry photos. Where was I going with this? Yes, but the other thing that you have to think about is not just the pace of the friendship, but it's almost like, to steal Kath's practice, it's the dramaturgy of a friendship as well. You have that first blush, and then you have the kind of lull period, and then you have the kind of infighting and the what are we doing? What are we really doing here? And a big part of our practice we've learned to recover is that we do a lot of our work socially, and we can't do that kind of really in the live space at the moment. But even talking about our check-in processes going for hours, well, they do. And our first couple of check-ins in the studio, our production partners were like, we've sat in a circle talking about our lives for 2 hours. Like, when are you going to start? And it's like, oh, well, it's the end of the day. The sandwiches have arrived. Everyone goes off. But friendship is a deep thing, and it's not something that you can fake. And when you fake it, the audiences see that, and there's no lasting effect in the community. So that's what we're really looking forward to. That we're excited that yes, we've gained more funding for the project because we're able to, perhaps put on an output that the funding bodies are going to be happy with this time around. But it's actually more that we get to continue these friendships and continue these relationships and have maybe a lasting effect in the community.
Also, I want to top up that in our case, our participants has all different degrees of disability. So when our founders found out, it's like, how are you going to work with these people? But we just had to learn how to embrace all different kinds of physical pacing, So some people quite capable to speak like in a normal speed, and other person can take like literally 5 minutes to speak one sentence. So that was the first day, big lesson. Hannah said, we planned so much, but we have to just redesign that. We have to just, rework that, because we have 12 participants who has all different pacing, and we can't just ask them, fit in one pace, which is, able bodies pacing. So that was kind of like big epiphany for 4 of us. And I believe we created our own pacing and our own time in our own space. So there was kind of like big spark moment to our participants. Okay, so there is a space and there are people who actually work with my own pacing. So there was kind of like beginning of build up our friendship and trust. So yeah.
Can I just say, to liberate ourselves from the construct of time and the demands to finish something, I often think of our projects as never finishing, and they are never finished. So if we have to tell someone what our output was, we can share where we got up to. And so it takes so much pressure off the urgency to say wherever we arrive is exactly where we are meant to arrive, in the same way that whoever's in the room is exactly who's meant to be in the room, in the same way that whatever we present is exactly what we have to present. And we're not finished, because friendship doesn't just finish when the funding finishes, and we will reconnect.
Just on that pacing, I've had some very humbling experiences over the years, and this year I've had some pretty big learning curves all over again, just when you think you know what you're doing. If I don't, you haven't got a clue. But around pacing was that around communication methods and using what Danya would say is like white supremacist, academic, hurry, hurry, hurry. I'm sending you an email. I might even put a red exclamation mark next to it. I'm ringing you and I'm leaving voicemail messages. And understanding that that is just, for some communities and some cohorts, that's actually, it's really intrusive, it's incredibly rude, and I've had a project that completely fell over, that was funded, completely fell over, because I just approached the community so poorly. I thought I was doing a really respectful professional job, and approached them so poorly that it got to the point of where, when I finally did speak to somebody in the community, I said, I think I've gone about this the wrong way. And they just went, yeah, you have, mate, but do better next time, but not with us. I was like, yep. And having to really do that, of just having to be humble enough and to say, I've got that really wrong. And as you're saying, if I'm just if the output is just what I've managed to do, because I have to work at the pace of the people who are trusting me and giving me the enormous privilege of allowing me to work with them, then if I'm not working at that pace, then the project's just doomed regardless. Which is, a really hard way to work within funding, like funding landscape, and within academic timeframes of what were your outputs for that year, yeah. But it's, it's the only way, because the relationship is the project, and you get a bad name really quickly, and you get a good name, and you have to hang on to it.
I was going to respond to what you're saying, Donna, by saying I am the inverse, which is that I don't actually notice time. I actually have to look at a clock and I have to trace it.
and I don't know where I am ever in time and space. And I long to be like you. No, I do, because I think you can also be someone who's too slow or too unaware of time. So I think with pacing, it's almost like, you know, like listening to Nathan speak, I just feel calm. Do you feel that? I just feel safe and calm. I feel like I'm inside your time when you speak, Nathan. So I think when you're a practitioner like myself who has very good intentions but doesn't understand time, that can sometimes be really stressful for the people around me, and there's laughter. So I think mastery of actually, and maybe mastery is the wrong word, mindfulness of time as a technical tool in development work is a really important thing, where we don't just inhabit our sense of time intuitively, but somehow we lift above and understand our patterns of engagement with it and what is the best we can offer the community that we're working with, maybe.
That was a nice segue there to the term community, which is our theme today. We're really talking about time, place, space, relationships, all within the different communities that we're working in. Last call for questions. I think Sue's got one.
So Donna, talking about the Milpera School project and landing on the idea of belonging, was that kind of really obvious to you going into it, or did you do a bit of questioning or whatever to land on that?
Donna, maybe you can repeat that question and your answer for the people on Zoom.
Yeah. So Sue asked, with the Milpera project, with the understanding that was all about belonging, was that clear to me kind of immediately, or did I come to that slowly? Look, a little bit of both. I was, for that project, I was actually coming off the back of a couple of projects, so I felt quite attuned, instead of sometimes I'm just really not, because I haven't done any community work for a while, but I felt quite attuned to being able to see and hear what I thought maybe was a good starting point. Wasn't, I thought maybe this is a good starting point. But I also spoke to, there are some really great staff members there, and the staff at Milpera are really diverse as well. And so in the lead into the project, I was able to kind of throw that out to them to say, if I started at this place, does that sound like something like the young people would kind of respond to, or does it feel too abstract? And they were like, no, that's a great place to start. So it was a little bit of both. It was something I kind of intuitively thought, oh, maybe this is what I'm seeing, and then having that fed back, and then, so it was, and sometimes you're right and you're wrong, but that was just one of those instances where it was the right starting point. So it was, which was just really, lucky, actually.
Fantastic. Thanks, Donna. We're at 12 o'clock now, so that sounds like a good chance to wrap things up. But we will be back here tomorrow, and the schedule for all the talks tomorrow is available via the Creative Placemaking for Social Impact group website on QUT, on the QUT webpage. Tomorrow we start with a talk from Frank Newman, who's the program lead for creative leadership in schools at the Sydney Opera House, and he's talking about some of his great schools-based outreach work, which is really interesting, along with talks from Sandra Gattenhoff, Michael Whelan, and some person called Gavin Carfoot. Please, everyone online and in the room, let's thank our presenters today for their wonderful responses and presentations.
Evan as well.
And it's been a privilege to be here talking to you today, and we hope to see you tomorrow. Let's see you then.